last week we ended up, because it was the January thing, we talked about the January 1989 time period and how over the previous year and a half, if I summarize this right, let me know, that the business in Jim Crockett Promotions had gone down and it was almost ready to get away from them, and to where many of the top guys, us included, were complaining about the money that we were making because we were on guarantees at that point, but they were minimum guarantees, and we had always made more than that. So a guarantee had never come into play. We made more money on payoffs, but all of a sudden, we were not making that much money on payoffs, and I speak for myself, the Midnight Express, and all the top guys in the company, and the guarantees, the minimum guarantees we had was that if we didn't make a certain amount at the end of the year, the contractual year, Crockett would make up for it at the end of the year, what they call now the balloon payment, right?
Right.
Well, as I said, that had never come into play, but all of a sudden it was, our money was down that we were pocketing and business was not good. And that's when they discovered that Vince had sabotaged them on pay-per-view. We covered that with the Survivor Series 87 opposite Starrcade. And then the Royal Rumble in January 88 opposite the first Bunkhouse Stampede. So Crockett had been kind of stymied on pay-per-view. Turner Broadcasting had helped him get full cable clearance for Bash 88. And that's where they started talking about being partners. And the TV syndicated television advertising revenue that they thought was going to make them a fortune was not materializing, despite the fact they'd bought all these territories and bought all these TV time slots to go along with them. So Crockett was at the time that we started renegotiating our contracts, we being myself and Midnight Express, he still thought that the TV ad revenue was going to come in and that they knew that they were going to get the Bash 88 on pay-per-view. Sometime either during or right after the negotiation and the signing of the contract, he found out he was in the hole and this money wasn't coming apparently. And they opened up talks with TBS in spring-ish of 88. But meanwhile, we also covered that Dusty Rhodes, as the booker, knew they had to get business back up, whether there was going to be a sale or not. They just wanted to get business back up, and he put everything in place in, say, March, April, and May and June of 88 to where business in June was probably the worst it had been. But then July, the Great American Bashes, things popped back, and they were able to keep business up for the returns to the towns in August and September with the Flair Luger rematches and the Midnight Express against the Horseman Tully and Arn with JJ. And then some members of the Crockett family started talking to Jimmy about maybe not selling because things had turned back around, but they were a couple $1 million in the hole. He didn't want to, none of them wanted to risk their mother's retirement that old man Crockett had set up, which is a family business. So they decided to sell, which happened officially on November 1st, 1988. So we went through all the gates of the Bash and all of the gates in the fall and how business had rebounded. And then we looked at what a couple months under the TBS regime had done when they hired Jim Herd, fired Dusty as booker. Jim Crockett was the interim booker from December of 89 to January or December of 88, January of 89, where they brought George Scott in. And we left off where January was in a mess with the exception of the bright spot of Ricky Steamboat. Everything was either a TV taping or a house show that was not drawing that well. They were running the buttermilk run towns like Goose Creek, South Carolina, and whatever the fuck it may be, Sumter, while trying to run big towns across the country, including towns that were not necessarily Crockett backbone territory. And things were pretty grim in January. They were. Would you term it that way? Grim would be a description of what business was in January 1989.
You know, it's weird for me because I never saw it and I can never see it, not knowing that there was so much shit going on behind the scenes. It's definitely hard to watch and not realize this is like weird weight. This is weird period where things are mismatched, like Matsuda with Flair. And, you know what I mean? Just like things that just like, what is going on here? But then good things happen eventually, like Steamboat. But there was a weird feeling in the air, that like period where I think technically Dusty was still there, wasn't he?
Dusty, well, only for a couple weeks. By January, early January, I believe especially a guy like Dusty, had been one of the biggest box office attractions in the business, when he's relieved as booker. But in any case, when you relieve the booker, it's hard for the booker to stay in the territory and just be one of the boys, unless he's also got an interest in the office or something else. Generally, that would mean that the booker would go elsewhere. And they were going to keep him as a talent, or maybe I don't know what the contractual situation was. I don't think Dusty wanted to settle for that, and that's when he moved back to Florida and started his own promotion for a period of time there. But I think by January-ish, he had gone home.
Well, let me ask you a hypothetical real quick, because I never thought about it. But I know when Bill Watts went into WCW in '92, he did have to have that meeting with Dusty where he said, they wanted me to get rid of you, but I said you could work under me, that you and I could work together. And Dusty said, I'd be happy to work for you. And it worked out, fairly well, I guess. I mean, I don't know how good some of the TV was in the later part of '92, but whatever, it worked out okay. Do you think in '89, beginning of '89, when they're going through this period, you hear a lot of different names like Larry Matisick, or obviously Jim Barnett gets back in the mix. You hear Bill Watts' name may have been tossed about. If there had been a time, where it would have happened almost seamlessly to when Dusty got relieved as booker and he was still under contract, that Bill Watts had been the person to come in. Do you think it was no matter who was there, Dusty had to go, or there was someone that could have been put in that position where Dusty had said, okay, I'm not the booker, but this person still sees me as a top star. Let's see how this works. I'm comfortable here.
Well, yeah, I think it could have been a Bill Watts, or there weren't too many people it could have been. But at the same point, I think he started seeing also, what the fuck? I mean, looking at it from his own standpoint as they're going to beat me or diminish me or whatever the fuck. I could do my own thing, or I could go to New York or whatever. But also, I think he started seeing, wait a minute, I don't know whether anybody could run this thing or not, baby. There's fixed to be a lot of bullshit going on around here. I think it was probably best he went for everybody's purposes, including his own.
All right.
Because obviously I was not a fan of Dusty Polka Dots dancing with, whatever the fuck. But at that stage of his life, he was late 40s. It elongated his career some, but he made some money while he was up there. And that was probably the most. As a matter of fact, one time I think Dusty, I can't remember who he said it to, but he was down in Florida working in the earlier version of NXT or whatever. And he said to one of the guys, he said, Vince better be glad I didn't save all of my money. But anyway, but yeah. And now we won't just look into everything daily minute detail, but hitting the high spots between January and the summer. They fired Dusty as booker, so all the stuff that he had planned is out the window, and some of that was even with him because Tully and Arn had left. Then Jimmy Crockett just sits on it for 6 weeks till they get George Scott, and George Scott bungles it so fucking bad that I mean, some people have not heard the story apparently because it's been so long, but he thought the Iron Sheik was going to I love Sheiky, but he thought he was getting the 1978 Iron Sheik and he was getting the 1988 Iron Sheik, and he signs the Sheik to a $100,000 contract to come back to TV, and they use him for 3 months, and by that point he was not mobile enough or physical enough or whatever the fuck, it just wasn't working, so they had to pay him $100,000. They sent him home after 3 months. But then the following year, he'd been gone so long, they forgot that he was still under contract, and it rolled over. And they had to pay him another $100,000 for another year. So they brought him back to TV to do jobs, thinking they'd job him out and he'd quit. But he said, fuck it, I'll put anybody over. And the squash matches were with him putting guys over were so bad they couldn't air them. So they sent him back home and paid him the other $100,000. George Scott, he made questionable talent. Remember the break dancing, what the fuck, Jay Strongbow's son?
Mark Young, was that it?
Vincent Young.
Well, he's had a few different names, yeah.
He's had a few different names, but he was a breakdancing dumb fuck that was Strongbow's son. He was rotten. George Scott brought his own stooge son, Byron Scott. Bobby Eaton disliked Byron Scott. That shows you what kind of just a weasel he was. He'd walk by in the locker room and almost lean sideways and fall over trying to listen to your conversation so he could go to his dad and stooge. So a lot of the talent started looking to depart.
A lot of talent did depart. I mean, if you just look at this changeover from Crockett to Turner, a lot of the guys, they may not have been top of the card guys, but guys who have been there the entire run. Jimmy Valiant, Ivan Koloff, they're gone. Wyndham leaves pretty quickly, too, into 89.
Yeah, well,
Nikita.
Barry without Dusty, he saw what was going on. Nikita, in a few of those cases, the guys that were Crockett favors and Crockett lifers didn't carry over to the new administration, but since Paul Jones was an old friend of George Scott's, they made Paul an agent. and the talent turnover was severe. And like I said, a lot of it was not for good. So all of those changes started happening under George Scott. And once again, yes, he did bring in Steamboat, and that's a no-brainer. But at the same time, all the other things that he did, including not understanding that they'd just been bought by a TV company. And so you need to fucking promote the Clash of Champions, which led to his downfall. But just the month of March leading up on the Clash, in Greensboro, here was the card in Greensboro that drew 4,600 people, which would have been a downer at any time, in the previous fucking 15 years. But Dan Spivey versus Ron Simmons, Eddie Gilbert versus Kevin Sullivan, Kendall Windham versus Vince Young, Dick Murdoch versus Abdullah the Butcher, Sting versus Butch Reed, the Iron Sheik and Steve Casey, the Samoan SWAT team versus the Midnight Express, Barry Windham versus the Junkyard Dog, Mike Rotunda versus Rick Steiner, Lex Luger versus Steve Williams for the U.S. title, and Rick Steamboat versus Ric Flair for the world title. In Greensboro, that only drew 4,600 people. Twice as many guys as they ever put on fucking most of the cards. And a lot of named talent that in other places and in other times had done well, but it wasn't happening. And because the company did everything wrong. From pissing, obviously Greensboro, this is after Starrcade had been taken away from them, 2 years in a row. But everything from the local promos that went from the ones that we would do for 7-8 hours every Wednesday. We're coming to Charlotte. We're going to be there in Philly. Flair selling the Marriott bar. Individual localized promos with the top guys that can talk. They were getting fucking canned green screen shit inserted into event centers like fucking Vince did. The emphasis was being taken off of the syndicated TV, which was really what sold the tickets in the that's why they got more main events than the TBS show did. The syndicated TV sold the tickets in the individual markets. Well, they were putting everything, had gone to center stage for TBS television, and they were putting all their eggs in that basket. And syndication was becoming more of the green screen shit, where sometimes there'd be two versions of it with two sets of announcers. And they'd put one place and one the other place. It was dying out. That was a big part of it. As we'll talk about here in a minute, they didn't know what nights to run what towns and when to run what towns and what towns to run. And even when they kept some of the local promoters, like I think Elliot Murnick worked for them for a little while, they didn't keep Sandy Scott, I don't believe, much past the initial transition period. But even Gary Juster, that fucking company, the infrastructure of that office immediately could not do the minorest things and have them come off. And between the uprooting of all of the talent and the switches in the talent and especially after George Scott was gone and they went to a committee, when you've had like 4 or 5 changes in booking philosophy in a 6-month period, it was fucking grim. So, like I said, in March, that was a card in Greensboro that you would have thought, especially with Flair and Steamboat, but it has to be the current TV product, and it has to be the promotion of the live event. And it has to be whether you've pissed a lot of your fan base off. And in a lot of these towns, also the TV tapings, the endless squash match, fucking bullshit TV tapings in front of arena crowds that have seen the best house show cards over the last several years that they could possibly fucking see. And now they're looking at TV tape, and the shows, they started to get so fancy. They looked shiny, like they had a budget, and they became more cookie cutter. The guys were on contracts now, and that's another thing. We mentioned that TBS assumed the contracts of all the guys from Crockett, and they were paying, instead of balloon payments, they were paying equal installments every 2 weeks on these contracts. And I know, somebody like Kevin Nash might not fucking see it this way. The guaranteed contracts where you had your actual salary rather than a guaranteed minimum, but you knew you were going to make more than that if business was up, when you just started getting the same amount of money every 2 weeks, regardless of how many times you worked or how long you worked or what match you were in, that was the end of the fucking wrestling business right there, son, especially the live event business. Because a lot of people decided, well, we're going to fucking sit around, or it's only goddamn Gaffney or whatever the fuck it was. So a lot of that contributed. But then the Superdome, when was it? Where was the guy there? No. The Superdome, April, I'm looking in my book. Class April 2nd.
April 2nd.
Okay. This was their opposition to WrestleMania, right? They were still doing that because, Vince was trying to block Crockett off and then TBS off pay-per-views. So TBS started the Clash of Champions to have a free show against WrestleMania to hurt Vince back. So TBS really wanted this fucking thing to do well, right? George, and it was Flair and Steamboat in the fucking rematch. George Scott figured out a way to not promote it on television because since they were doing Flair and Steamboat in the houses, he thought that it would kill the fucking houses to have people watch the Clash of Champions. So therefore he didn't promote it, and it did a 4.3 rating, and there wasn't 5,000 people in the fucking Superdome. It looked like the crowd was like a piss hole in a snowbank. So at that point, that's when they finally smartened up and realized George Scott was in over his head and fired fucking George Scott. But in the process, the damage had been done. Now think about here was the card was us against the Samoan SWAT team with Paul Lee, Samu, and Fatu. And this was brutal because since George Scott didn't like us anyway, and we'd already announced that we'd give our notice because he was the booker and we were leaving over that, we were getting beat every fucking night. And they had told, and I'm sure Paul Jones did, tell it to the Samoans to go over strong because one of them told us that one night. So it's impossible to have a match with these guys as the Midnight are baby faces now, but I had my program with Paul Lee, but the whole reason the Midnight were baby faces because the original Midnight, that program's been fucked. So we're just serving our fucking penance by putting the fucking Samoans over it. It was just because they couldn't sell anything but each other because they're big, strong guys and blah, blah, blah. So it was brutal. So we opened the show and stank the joint out. And then we left and went back to our hotel so we could watch Flair and Steamboat on TV instead of watching on the monitor. But it was a JYD and Butch Reed in the Superdome didn't mean anything when it could have drawn 30,000 people fucking 5 years beforehand. Muta versus Steve Casey, Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Murdoch, Mike Rotunda and Steve Williams against the Road Warriors, Ranger Ross versus the Iron Sheik, Eddie Gilbert and Rick Steiner against Dan Spivey and Kevin Sullivan, Steamboat and Flair. And as you can see, a massive talent turnover and also a massive reshuffling of talent, and they were in different places from 3 months before. But at least they got George Scott fired, we thought, right? Because at least we were supposed to finish up on April 20th, I think, where we had given our notice because of George Scott, but they fired him first. So immediately they instituted a committee. a booking committee, and it was Jim Ross and Eddie Gilbert and Kevin Sullivan and, of course, Barnett and Jody Hamilton. And I may be overlooking somebody, but also Herd had to be involved no matter what, right? But the difference in that and what was to come with Flair was there was no, as I understand it, there was no head booker. Everybody was members of committee, and the only head was Herd because he was running the company. So you had no head creative guy. You had some very creative guys pitching ideas, and at least they knew how to use talent better. But also, that size ship is impossible to turn even when you see the iceberg. So they fired George Scott at the 1st of April, but in April, May, and June, things would get worse. The committee, JR and I think it was JR, Kevin, everybody was in favor, but JR's one came to us and said, well, will you guys stay? And we said, no, because we want to take a break. They've beat us to fucking powder. Bobby his knee was tweaked, and we had taken a couple dates in May for Dundee because we thought we were going to be gone. He was booking Continental, and we wanted a vacation. We said, how about this? We'll take 6 weeks off. They re-signed us before we finished, so we kept getting paid. So that was nice. But we would take 6 weeks off, and Bobby's knee would heal up. We'd make the shots. We'd committed to Dundee. I was going to take a vacation in Louisville and also go to Gatlinburg, and we were going to come back and have a renewed push so the people would try to get the bad taste out of their mouth of what we had done since the original Midnight thing fell apart. So that was so we were out most of April and May, except for a couple TV tapings where we came back in the World Tag Team title tournament, and we were very happy for a short period of time until that's when I actually first had to sit down and start having meetings about our contracts with Jim Herd, which it's a whole hour story by itself. It's been told other places, but we offered to take a cut since we were some of the highest paid guys in the company, which is why they'd been jobbing us out to begin with. And he offered us an amputation. So that was, how shall we say, challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, let me ask you, when was the first time you saw Ranger Ross and the Combat Kick?
Okay, Ross, he was a nice guy, and he was a legitimate armed services hero, and et cetera, but he'd been working for Jody Hamilton in the local Georgia promotion, and he just wasn't ready. And even though he's a good athlete and he could do some shit, they wanted to, even then, they wanted to find lower priced fucking talent and or cut guys guarantees, except for, Herd was in love with Luger and Sting because of the way they looked, and he could understand that because that's all he really could understand is what he could see in front of him. He didn't understand anything else about the business. And otherwise, they wanted to cut the payoffs. They wanted to have more guys on the card, but pay each one of them less money. And, when you go through that many booking administrations, you're bringing in guys and signing them to contracts. And the next guy may think, what the fuck? But he's got to use the guy because he's under contract with the company. It's not his fault they changed the booker. So for the next 2 years, you had at least a half a dozen of those on the card at any given moment that the current administration could have give two flying fucks about, but they had contracts.
And then beyond the bookers, in terms of who was there as an agent or who was there just helping out behind the scenes, you mentioned Paul Jones lasted at least through George Scott's tenure. When was Wahoo already back in the picture, or was that a little bit later?
No, I think Wahoo came back, I think as a result of Flair, which makes perfect sense. And I believe it was the same time period. He came back as an agent. So, yeah, Wahoo came back, I think, as a favor to Flair. Ole came back at that time as, I don't know if he does anybody favors, but he came back when Flair was around because of the, shortage of horsemen. So it eventually it got to be a good group of guys, and they, when they retired Terry without telling him first or asking him first, they made him an agent, oh joy, and put him on a creative team later on. And then, as I think he described one time, it was too many chefs and not enough stew. But anyway, there was no continuity of anything. There was a lot of questionable talent decisions. There was talent hurt by questionable finish decisions. Even though Flair was able to, and we've talked about that in the past, able to get the television ratings back up and the pay-per-view ratings back up by the end of the year and the beginning of 90, the house show business really never came back because they were just, well, we'll get into a couple details on that here in a second, but basically we were out most of April and May, and we come back in June for the World Tag Team Title Tournament, and which I was going to finish up on the live Clash of Champions from Fort Bragg, which was a free show for servicemen there. So it was not only sold out, it was standing room, and the walls were sweating perspiration from the goddamn the heat. It was like 120 in there. So it was a great house, but it was, it was just the epitome. I think that was pretty much the low rating of that era, because even though, like I said, there was some great guys on the committee, there was no leader, and you can't book by committee. And also George Scott's reign had done so much damage in a short period of time that it just wasn't going to come back that quick. But the Clash card, Guts and Glory from Fort Bragg, did a 3.8.
The hottest event I've ever seen.
Yeah. Oh my God. It was when Paulie knocks me out in the finish, I'll talk about in a second, and the EMTs took me outside. I was really selling being like fucking fucked, because it was like almost heat exhaustion at that point. But they had a tag team tournament semifinals, Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin, with Terry Gordy in the corner. Boy, that was a rib on Shane Douglas and Johnny Ace, the dynamic dudes. They have Gordy in the corner, the one guy they wanted to work with. They had decided they were going to go with the Freebirds as the top heel team. But it wasn't the Freebirds of Michael and Terry Gordy, because Terry still had his Japanese deal, which was more money and more important, but he was making dates for them when he was here. But so Jimmy Garvin became a Freebird. And I've said this before. I was a fan of gorgeous Jimmy Garvin, the 200-pound chicken shit heel, with the hot girl. But all of a sudden, Jimmy Garvin, after doing that in this company for the previous 3 fucking years or whatever, comes back after being gone for 6 months as now he's going to be a badass. And the Freebirds decided they were going to be badasses. And it was hard to work with them because they didn't want to sell anything. And I'd been friends with Jimmy. Me and the Midnight and him and Precious had split rental cars. My wife at the time was friends with their nanny, et cetera, et cetera. But he was in a mood, trying to be a tough guy, and just made me a little cranky. At one period or one TV taping in Savannah, and I'm a babyface still. We'll get to that in a second. Garvin rolls in because they're going to fucking jump us all, and he rolls in, and I'm going to take a bump for him, but he just comes steamrollers me with the forearm fucking shove, you're going down whether you like it or not thing. So I take a bump. I actually clipped my knee, so that was a little tweaked. Take a bump, roll out, sell on the floor. Here come the other baby faces, run them off. I get up selling my jaw. I put my arm around one of the baby faces, kind of drag my ass back selling. He was mad at me because I didn't stay down and have somebody carry me out. I'm like, I'm bigger than you. You hit me once. What the fuck? Eddie Gilbert comes over because Garvin's yelling and he was on the supplements. I was like, what the he's like, just ignore him. I'm like, what the fuck? I'm bigger than he is. It's not fucking, Mike Tyson didn't fucking hit me.
So who's responsible, though? Who was the person that, of those people you named on that early 89 booking committee after George Scott, who was the person that said, let's push this new lineup of the Freebirds out of all the tag teams that were there? And there were good and bad, but there were a lot of tag teams there at the time. Who was the person who said the Freebirds should be the guys we push as the champions?
I was not in those meetings, and so I don't know. I was not in those meetings yet. As a matter of fact, many of these decisions are why I was soon to be in the meetings. But so Freebirds and the Dynamic Dudes, Ranger Ross versus the Terrorist, who was Doug Gilbert, because Eddie was on the committee also. The Ding Dongs defeated Cougar J and George South, the Ding Dongs debut. So right there you go. That's what they're fucking looking at on television, regardless of the talent. Once again, when you have a fucking mud show, outlaw, indie fucking rific gimmick, clown show bullshit on one of the matches, even though the main event is Ricky Steamboat and Terry Funk, you have shit on your show. And to this day, more people probably remember the Ding Dongs than they do the Steamboat wrestled Funk, except they're really dedicated. Anyway, other tag team tournament semifinal. Midnight Express defeated the Samoan SWAT team. Finally, we beat them. And as we had a fan hit the ring during my introduction. Anyway, and we were the baby faces. Steve Williams double count out Terry Gordy in 6 minutes. Norman the Lunatic pinned Mike Justice. See, once again, you go from Steve Williams versus Terry Gordy to Norman the fucking Lunatic. You go from the Midnight Express to Samoans right after the Ding Dongs. Kevin Sullivan and Mike Rotunda beat the Steiners. Sting pinned Bill Irwin for the TV title. And then the Tag Team Championship Tournament Finals, the Freebirds beat the Midnight Express because Paul Lee came out and whacked me with a loaded tennis racket, which it was revealed to be loaded because since it was his, they opened it up and there was a horseshoe and a chain. It was a little fucking wink and a nod. And then Ricky Steamboat beat Terry Funk by disqualification in the main event in 12 minutes. They probably should have given them a little bit more time.
Well, again, it was a hot room. I don't know if they should have.
Well, that's true. That's true. And maybe come to think of it, Terry might have called an audible. But anyway, you see, it was like schizophrenic fucking wrestling, right? Is what we came back to. You had a match with serious talent, and then you had fucking just gaga. And especially on a big show, our audience, the Crockett audience, the NWA audience, was not used to seeing shit like that. So at any rate, that was the big show in June. And as we've mentioned, every year previously had geared up for the July version, the Great American Bash Tour, right? And Dusty in 1988 had gotten business back to where we mentioned a number of huge houses, $147,000 in Philadelphia, $206,000 in Baltimore, $105,000 in Norfolk, over $100,000 in Raleigh and Greensboro, Chicago. So in 88, things, he got it back to where it was presentable. But for all these things happening and going on, I'm going to turn to July of 1989. This is when we're back. And the Midnight Night, we know we have to be heels, but we left as baby faces. We had to come back as baby faces. And we've had this program going with the fucking Freebirds, especially after the disputed finish in the tag team title tournament on TV, where we would come back in the houses. But it was increasingly hard. If Gordy wasn't there in the corner, then there were three of us baby faces and me carrying the feared tennis racket against two heels. And to be honest, let's face it, Jimmy Garvin, once again to that audience, should not have been in the ring with the Midnight Express in that picture. I'm sorry. But also it wasn't the real Freebirds that people had in mind, and also all the other problems going on, and they wanted to be the Road Warriors. So it was hard to fucking work those matches. And we were miserable. So were the fans apparently that were watching them. But we think, all right, at least, I figured if we were going to switch back heel, I was going to have to come up with the idea and somehow sell somebody on it. But right then, we've just been back a couple of weeks, right? So July 1st, guess where they ran? You can't guess, can you?
Oh, I thought it was one of those.
Rhetorical? Yeah. Like most of the questions. July 1st was Charlotte, North Carolina at the new Charlotte Coliseum. Charlotte, North Carolina, the origination of the Great American Bash in 1985. They had over 25,000 people at the Memorial Stadium to see Ric Flair flying in that helicopter as a hometown hero and face the Russian nightmare Nikita Koloff in the Battle of the USA and Russia. Over $250,000 house, an outdoor stadium. In 1986, they did $234,000 and 23,000 people in a stadium. In 1987, they still did $174,000 and 15,000 people in a stadium. And in 88, they'd done a respectable $98,000, even though it was a major disappointment, and probably about 8,000 or 9,000 people. Charlotte and the new Coliseum in September of 1988. We had opened up the new Coliseum with Tully and Arn in the Midnight and Flair and Luger and done 13,500 people and over $100,000 house. 9 months later, they run Charlotte, the new Coliseum. The house was $37,000. And they'd also raised the prices by then, so you weren't even getting really a $10 average. So that was less than 3,000 people. And we were defeated by the Freebirds for the World Tag Team title, or in the World Tag title match. But the card, Luger versus Steamboat, Samoan SWAT Team versus Road Warriors, Midnight Express versus Freebirds, Sting versus Terry Funk, the Steiners versus the Varsity Club, Gordy versus Murdoch, the Skyscrapers, Sid Vicious and Danny Spivey had just arrived. Against Randy Rose and Ranger Ross, Brian Pillman versus Bill Irwin, the New Zealand Militia versus the Ding Dongs. Maybe we have it there. But the point is, even though more guys than ever before and a lot of talent that had drawn in other places, $37,000, not even 3,000 people. The next day they were in the Omni and didn't do 7,000 people. And as a matter of fact, we weren't even on the card, by the way. No, yes, we were. Yes, we were. I tell a lie. We were there against the Freebirds. And once again, didn't do 7,000 people when Atlanta for a bash in 86 had done 185 grand. In 87 had done 245 grand for the War Games. So at any rate, July 1st was Charlotte. July 2nd was the Omni. July 3rd, we did TV in Columbia, South Carolina. July 4th, the 4th of July, we did a TV taping in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in front of nobody. And by the way, Fayetteville, North Carolina, may not sound like much, but in 86, Fayetteville had done $104,000. In 87, it had done 88. In 88, it had done $66,000. In 89, they made it a TV taping. So we're getting like $150 and $200 payoffs since they're just, well, they're paying us at random because the houses, in a lot of cases, you couldn't do the old formula, or I think the guys would have to pay the office some for working. So they were just giving guys nominal payoffs because at the end of every 2 weeks, you would get a contract payment that would bring you up to nobody was making their contract minimums on payoffs. They were getting nominal payoffs, $200, $300, $400 a night, whatever the fuck, more for Flair and those guys. And then you'd get it when you got your check at the end of 2 weeks, they would say contract payment balance due, and you'd get like several $1,000s. So they were losing money on every show they ran here. July 5th, Charleston, South Carolina, outdoors at the stadium. It was a $300 payoff. I don't know what the house was. Midnight Express and Dr. Death versus the Freebirds. July 6th, Marietta, Georgia, another TV taping. We made $150. Roanoke, Virginia, on the 7th. Roanoke was a $75,000 to $100,000 town for the bashes. I don't know what the house was. A lot of times they wouldn't even tell you anymore unless one of the, whoever the local promoter was smart to the business and knew why I wanted to know. But we got a $350 payoff, so it was nothing. Listen to this. Boston, Massachusetts, at the Boston Garden on July the 8th. Less than 5,000 people and a $57,000 house to go to Boston in the middle of the Bash tour, right? But we have to go to Boston, which none of us know our way around Boston. We figure out where all the guys are staying. This hotel at the airport is like a upgraded Super 8 fucking chain. We fly up there. We're flying commercial now because Crockett has no plane. And we get there and we check in and we find the Boston Garden and we work. And that's the night, by the way, that Dr. Death took issue with Jimmy Garvin with the chair. I've told that, Samantha. Should I tell it again here just for context?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Not only were the Freebirds not selling for the Midnight Express, but when we'd have six-mans where it would be Hayes and Gordy and Garvin against the Midnight and Dr. Death, the only person that would sell for any of us was Gordy. The one guy who shouldn't really be selling, but he was the guy who was selling, and Doc got pissed. So this night in the Boston Garden in front of this shitty house, all the way up north where none of us know anything about what the fuck's going on nor care to be at that point, we shine a little bit with a couple of high spots, and then plus they pretty much ignore me because if I'm a baby face, so I shouldn't interfere. But if I try to interfere or act like I'm going to do something during the heat, they just ignore me. instead of trying to get away from me or whatever the fuck. So I'm there like a spare prick at the wedding. But we shine a little bit. Then they get a long set of heat on Bobby. And then fucking, I think Stan gets the tag and makes a comeback, and they kind of sell for the comeback, and then they fuck us with a fuck finish, boom, and get the win, 1, 2, 3. And then while all the baby faces are, I'm, trying to help one of them up, and somebody's laying there selling, they decide to jump us again and get some heat afterwards. And Dr. Death said, fuck this. And he grabs one of those old wooden chairs that they still had in the Boston Garden. And he's outside on the floor trying to chase Jimmy Garvin. Jimmy Garvin's not going to back up from him. And Doc raises that chair over his head, and Paul Bunyan Jimmy Garvin with that wooden chair. Whack! And Garvin screams, fuck! And Doc screams, fuck with me! And it's like that. Every time he whacks him, Garvin screams, fuck, and Doc screams, fuck with me. And Garvin is backing up, and the pieces of the chair are flying, and it cut his fucking wrists and elbows up, and it had big fucking bulge on his elbow. And I think he had to take a day off the next day or whatever. Well, we all had a day off. I'll get to that in a minute. Had to take a couple of days off because he was all beat up from that chair. So finally they leave. And here comes the Midnight Express and Dr. Death, and I'm in the back. I'm like, well, here we go. And they rush into the fucking locker room, and something would have happened had not Bobby Eaton been the one of all people to speak up and start yelling and say, hey, we ain't just here to get you goddamn guys over. And when Bobby was the one to be hot and yelling for the first time that everybody's ever remembered, then it all calmed down. But I think Doc was wanting to continue, and that would have been interesting to see, because I don't know whether Gordy would have stuck up for Garvin. He would have stuck up for Hayes against Doc, but I don't know if he'd have stuck up for Garvin. So it all could have been very interesting. So emotions were on the edge, as they say. So then we go back to our fucking cheap hotel at the Boston airport, and guess what? The next day we're supposed to be in Providence, Rhode Island. Not at the Providence Civic Center, but at Brown University. It's at Mechlin Auditorium or whatever, Meechin Auditorium. I've scratched it out in my book. They canceled that show due to lack of interest. So basically, we're in Boston, and Monday we're in Springfield, Massachusetts, where the NWA has never run before, right? So we have to sit at this goddamn Super 8 at the fucking Boston airport, wherever the fuck we were. We weren't going to go driving around in Boston. Just getting to the Garden and back was hair-raising enough. We sat there and ate delivery pizza for an entire Sunday. Stan Lane was about to go out of his mind. He had no pussy in Boston, no hint of anywhere, he'd never been there, right? So we sit in this, pay $55 for the hotel room and $32 for my delivery pizza and whatever the fuck I had 3 meals of without leaving my room. And the following Monday, July 10th, we go to Springfield, Massachusetts, where it was actually, where it was the Midnight Express versus Terry Gordy and Jimmy and Michael Hayes, I think, because Jimmy Garvin was off or whatever the fuck. At any rate, guess what the house was in Springfield?
What was Boston was what, 5,000?
Boston was $57,000, less than 5,000 fans. Guess what Springfield was?
3,000 fans.
Well, you're almost right, except not. It was $11,000, which means that not 1,000 people came to the Civic Center in Springfield, Massachusetts to see what the fuck we were doing there. And that card, just to show you how they couldn't fucking draw a goddamn money with green crayons and paper. It was Lex Luger versus Ricky Steamboat for the U.S. title, Sting versus Terry Funk, the Road Warriors versus the Samoan SWAT team, the Midnight Express versus the Freebirds, the Skyscrapers versus Johnny and Davey Rich. Sid Vicious won a 2-ring battle royal. Great Muta over Rick Steiner, Mike Rotunda and Dick Murdoch, the Dynamic Dudes and the New Zealand Militia. Like not even 1,000 people.
That's amazing. Because
it's Springfield, Massachusetts. We've never been there before. Nobody gives a fuck, and nobody apparently knew how to promote it. So the next day we figure, well, at least we'll have Chicago, right? Because we've been in this goddamn shithole in Massachusetts for 3 days to work 2 shows, and nobody went to either one of them. We're going to fly to Chicago on July the 11th. The flight was canceled. We missed the fucking show. In Chicago, they drew 3,000 people. Now, by the way, the Chicago Great American Bash in 87 did $136,000, sold out to over 10,000 people. In 88, it did 100,000. In 89, there was 3,000 people there, and we Eddie Gilbert, Scott Steiner, Bobby Eaton, Stan Lane, and Jim Cornette, according to the notes in this fine publication by Graham Cawthon, WCW 89 to 94, we all missed the show because the fucking plane was fucked up. So it was like we couldn't get out of goddamn Massachusetts to save our life.
But it's interesting with Chicago, though. You point out that the Bash in 88 did over $100,000. So many people, the common perception is Starrcade 87 destroyed Chicago, and they never were able to rebuild it at all, even though it bottomed out again in 89. You're saying Bash 88, Chicago was back up to a respectable level.
Did $100,000, yeah. The Bash in 87, I think, was the first of like 6 sellouts 6 months in a row, ending with or 4 or 5 or whatever it was, ending with Starrcade, unfortunately, when the Road Warriors didn't win the belts. But still, the Bash 8, they did respectable houses in Chicago after that. Respectable, not that hot streak, but the Bash 88 was $100,000. And now, of course, they jacked the ticket prices up by this point. That's another thing. TBS had raised the ticket prices in all these markets. So they were seeing shit they didn't want to see, and they were paying more for it, right? So that really worked well because the Capitol Center, just a note here, at the Bash there, the tickets were $15, $12, and $8. So they had gotten past that, $10 average in most places. And, of course, the Bash has always had more expensive tickets for the big shows. But at any rate, so we missed Chicago, which does 3,000 people. But guess where we were the following day? July 12th, they decided to run the college in Carbondale, Illinois. I am not making this up. Carbondale, Illinois got Road Warriors versus is supposed to be the Samoan SWAT team, and Norman substituted. Sting versus Funk, Freebirds versus Midnight and Dr. Death, 2-ring battle royal, Muta and Gilbert, and more. And the house was $12,000, which means about 1,000 people. In Carbondale, Illinois, they didn't run Charleston, West Virginia, that was a $100,000 town, or they didn't run Richmond, Virginia that month. It was a $100,000 plus town in the past. They didn't run Norfolk that month. They didn't run Greensboro that month. They didn't run Raleigh or Greenville, South Carolina, but they ran Carbondale, Illinois. And then the following day, because this was when Hurd had hired that fucking moron, Don Glass, that used to work in the event routing and event booking department in the WWF under Ed Cohen, who was a genius and a great guy, right? But Don Glass was the coffee boy. Well, he somehow convinced the TBS people and Jim Hurd that since he knew everything about it, he had relationships with all these buildings, they could hire him, and he could do the same thing for the WCW that Ed Cohen was doing for the WWF, with all these great buildings and all these tours and routing. So see, when you're in Chicago, then you can drive to Carbondale, and then you can drive over to Tennessee. So we went from Carbondale, Illinois to Jackson, Tennessee with the same card. But that's when the Memphis territory was still alive and well and healthy. And in the Jackson Coliseum, we did $11,000. We did less than 1,000 people. Burt Prentice's shows now outdrew the entire WCW roster in Jackson, Tennessee on July 13th, 1989. And then we went to Memphis the next night when they had already had a big show the previous week from the Memphis group, just to make sure, and we did barely $25,000, which was probably about 2,000 people. And that looked good all of a sudden. Then we go to Richmond. Richmond, Virginia did run, because that's July 15th. And I don't even know what the house was. We got a $400 payoff. So I assume it was probably in the neighborhood of 30 grand-ish. Richmond, for the Great American Bash in 86, had sold out at 115 grand. 87 had done 125 grand. 88 had done 109 grand. But Richmond, as you'll recall, as I mentioned earlier, sold out with Midnight Horseman and Flair Luger in September of 88 did $140,000 and sold the building out. And 9 months later, they're back not doing 3,000 people with, everybody they've got. Then, of course, when you're in Richmond, Virginia, I mentioned there's great towns like Norfolk and Raleigh. But the better thing to do would be to fly across the country and the next day on Sunday, July 16th, do TV in Fort Worth, Texas. We got up in Richmond, Virginia on Sunday morning, took a commercial flight to fucking Dallas, Texas, got in a rental car and drove to Fort Worth to the Cowtown Coliseum and got there to do 2 syndicated TV shows, all in the same fucking day. And there was nobody there. Well, there was a couple of thousand people there, I think, because, it was fucking what it was. And then the following day on a Monday night, we're in Lubbock, $25,000 house, couple thousand people, but it was the small building there, so that wasn't bad. July 18th, we're in Amarillo doing another TV taping. And this time they somehow got a good house in there, but I don't know if it was all paid or if they papered it because it was TV. Then the following day, July 19th, we had off, but many of the guys did another TV taping in Atlanta at Center Stage. Then we were supposed to be in Lexington on July 20th at Rupp Arena. And I don't know whether they had a card there or not, but I've got off, so I think they may have canceled it. July 21st, we're in Dayton, Ohio for a rousing $250 payoff and no people whatsoever for a match with the New Zealand militia. Because has there been any kind of house that would look like a bash all month yet so far? No, not, right?
No, not at all.
Nothing. So, but we're going up to the one everybody remembers, the weekend of the Great American Bash on pay-per-view, Bash 89. The night before, we're in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia that night, I won't even bother you with the whole card, but the main event in Philadelphia is a 10-man Bad Street match. The Freebirds and the Freebirds of Garvin and Hayes and the Samoan SWAT team and against the Road Warriors, the Midnight, and Doc, right? And Gordy's in there also. You would think that would be a match that the people in Philadelphia, right? The Road Warriors, the Midnight Express, and Dr. Death against the Freebirds and the Samoans in a Bad Street match. Philadelphia. Guess what the house was? 39 grand. 3,000 people. Philadelphia. In 1986 at the stadium, we did $215,000 outdoors, and that, I believe, was the biggest cash grab in the history of Crockett Promotions, because Flair and I both thought there was like 15,000 people there. In 87, indoors at the Civic Center, they did $150,000. In 88, they did $147,000. The Philly indoor record, by the way, for the NWA was $161,000, a complete sellout of the Midnight Express and the Road Warriors scaffold match in January of 87 at higher ticket prices, in case you're interested. But once again, 39 grand, 3,000 people in Philadelphia. So that leads up to the next day, Sunday, July 23rd, the Great American Bash pay-per-view. It was a 5 o'clock show that day. A lot of people don't remember that also. That house did a sellout, $188,000 house at jacked up ticket prices. And guess what they got to see that they hadn't seen on any of those other fucking shows? Ric fucking Flair.
Yeah.
They had shot the deal in May when Flair won the belt back from Steamboat, and Funk came from the judge's desk and pile drove him, and Flair had been off. And there'd been question whether he was going to wrestle again or not, because of the neck injury. And remember, he'd been a heel, but now suddenly he's a babyface. He swears he's going to come back and get even with Terry Funk if it takes a year. And finally, they booked the match. And it's going to be on pay-per-view for the world to see. They're banking on it, right? Boom. So yes, that drew in Baltimore, and underneath it was the War Games, Midnight Express, Dr. Death, and Road Warriors against Freebirds and the Samoans, which was the only TV War Games that we did. But at any rate, that drew, and that showed that there was some life in all of this somewhere, because there was somebody they wanted to see and something they bought, right? That's where, when Flair looked at what had happened, and I'll finish July, it won't take long, but Flair looked at what happened, or what had happened, to all the house shows and to the towns they weren't running, and to the goddamn, lost opportunity and this Bash tour. It wasn't even really a Bash tour. They just advertised some shows as the Great American Bash. But he looked and he said, fuck this. This is going to get away from us and we ain't going to get it back. And that's when he demanded the book. And not only had Flair been instrumental in Ted Turner being the wrestler that Ted Turner knew, and Ted Turner buying the company to begin with, Flair was instrumental in the deal. If he gets Flair, he'll buy it. If not, he won't. But now they've had 6 months and fucking things are on their ass and at their worst, and they're losing money hand over fist. And somebody comes along that actually draws them a house. And the goddamn pay-per-view did fairly well also. So that gave Flair the fucking the leverage to say, I need to be in charge of this, or, what the fuck. And he got it. And the only reason, as we've recounted many times, and in the Midnight Express book and et cetera, the only reason he quit is because Herd would leave him fuck alone after he turned everything around but the house shows. He turned around the TV ratings and set records that they wouldn't touch again for 6 years. He turned the Clash ratings around. He turned the pay-per-views around, both in quality and in interest and buy rate. And had one of the better talent rosters that they had the whole time that Turner owned the company, for the first fucking 8 years or whatever. The only thing he never got back was the house shows, because they had done so much damage. And as a matter of fact, I didn't even think, hold on, I want to go back to June 28th. You notice that there was no Bash show in Greensboro. Greensboro, North Carolina didn't have a Bash tour event in the summer of '89. Think about that for a second. When 1986, Greensboro had done $257,000. They didn't have one there in 87 for some reason, but 88 had done $100,000. And Greensboro was the Golden Goose Town. They had run Greensboro in June on a Wednesday night for the first time in history. June 28th, Midnight Express against the Freebirds and others. Guess what the house was there in Greensboro? $19,000. 1,500 people.
Boy, that's really the story there. It's just the story of Greensboro from 87 to 89.
Yep.
That tells the whole story.
Because, and I love Joe Pedicino, and I'm not knocking him here. If he's listening, hello to you and Bonnie. But they had hired Joe because he was a knowledgeable fan there in the Atlanta area and had experience with his Pro Wrestling This Week show. But one time I actually was raging at one of the TV tapings in the locker rooms, and right after that Wednesday fucking Greensboro deal. And I said, goddamn, Joe, what the fuck? This can be better. They run a goddamn town like Greensboro on a Wednesday night and wonder why it don't draw for the first time ever and all this other shit going on. He said, well, we have to save the weekends for the big cities. And I said, what are you fucking talking about? Well, like a Chicago or a Minneapolis or what? I got my book out of my bag and I started flipping through and giving him Greensboro houses. I said 137,000, 200-something thousand, 180 fucking. I said, how much bigger do you want this city to fucking be? That you should cater your week around Greensboro, not stick it in on Wednesday night for the fucking sake of running it and embarrass yourself. Flair told me later on, that's when he was. One of the reasons why he asked me to be on the booking committee was he said when he heard me lecture in Pedicino and hauling out a book to prove what the gate was in Greensboro 3 years beforehand, he said, this motherfucker knows more about the fucking running of the company than the motherfuckers that are running the company. That's why he asked me later on. But at any rate, and that's the thing, that Bash day anyway, the pay-per-view Bash, that kind of cemented Flair's ability to go in and become the booker. And if personally, that was my high point of my babyface career, because that was the tuxedo match with me and Paul Lee. And the deal wasn't, everybody said, what, I think there was a question on the drive-through, well, tuxedo matches are comedy. No, it's a goofy stipulation, but, you know, when Harvey Whippleman and Howard Finkel did it, bless them, it was comedy. And they expected that me and Paul Lee would be comedy, and a lot of people have gone back and looked at it since it's on the network now, but even Bob Caudle and JR were ready for it to be funny. And I'd already sat down with Paul Lee and said, we ain't going to be funny. We've hated each other, and even the boys believe we hate each other. And he was all over this and in agreement with this. I said, we're going to have a fucking fight that looks like these two guys that may not be very athletic but hate each other, and they're trying their best, and you're going to be a little more pussy than I am because you're the heel. And, of course, the night before in that 10-man Bad Street match, I'm wearing my knee braces. They're fighting all over everywhere. I jump up on the apron to get out of the way because Gordy is raging on the floor. He picks up the 8-foot lunchroom table, and he's going to press it over his head and throw it over the top rope that I'm standing in front of, right? And I know Terry's stout, but I don't want to trust that he's going to clear my head with this thing. So as he throws the table, I jump off the apron of the ring and, well, fuck it. And I land on those goddamn mats, those fucking pussy mats they put out there, where all guys did was tear their ankles and turn their fucking knees. And goddamn, if you took a bump on those, it still fucking jarred you, but people thought it was all phony, no matter how good it looked. Whereas if you took a half-ass bump on the concrete, people said it was concrete and it got over. They had those mats out there, and I land with my left foot on the edge of the mat, and even though I'm wearing my knee braces, my fucking left knee goes out. And when I say go ahead, it bends in a manner other than which nature intended, far enough to tear cartilage. That's my definition of going out. And now I'm fucking limping, right? And by the next day, it was an afternoon show, but by the next day, I've already called my doctor in Charlotte. He said, well, you can come home and I could drain it because it's swollen up and it's tight. And he said, and I could take a look at it. I said, well, I can't do anything in the next few days or next few hours, can I? He said, not really. Just don't do anything athletic. All right. I am not going to not have this match with Paul Lee. Even though the boys are buried as baby faces, I'm going to get my revenge on Paul Lee, and then we can fucking switch back heel some way as soon as I can figure it out, right? And I may never get another chance to get even with Paul Lee with the way that the booking has been going so far. So I fucking borrowed some ace bandages and taped it up, and I borrowed a couple pain pills, which was hard to find in the locker room in those days. I found one from two different sources, and took those and put the knee brace on. And if you watch the tape, when I'm walking to the ring, slapping hands with the fans, I'm gritting, because if I can get to the ring without limping, which was a challenge, then we've got the deal set up where Paulie's going to work on my knee, right? And I can sell. So I get to the ring. We do the deal with he throws the fucking powder. Oh my God. He goes to fucking work on my knee. And I've told this story before too, but it bears repeating. I've sat in front of him for 2 hours previously going, okay, Paul, when you hit my knee with the phone, hit it as hard as you can on the knee brace on the side, right? And I'm showing him the knee. He goes for the wrong fucking knee. He starts hitting my good knee. And you see me trying to grab him by the shoulder and pull him over to say, other knee. Because now I'm the veteran. I'm the veteran worker in this scenario, right? I'm trying to call this fucking thing. So then he just starts hitting all the fucking knees, right? But it served its purpose. I could limp. We got through the fucking thing. I'm surprised it was as good as it was, because I literally could not walk, and it was very fucking, it was challenging, but we got through to it. I only potatoed Paul once. You can pick out in the comeback which one it was. And it was acceptable, but even Bob Caudle and JR had to start calling it seriously when he's slapping me in the face as hard as he can. And I'm fucking selling like I'm goddamn crippled. You know, they picked up on the story. So we enjoyed that. And the following day, the best part about it was, instead of having to go to goddamn Altoona, Pennsylvania, I got to fly home and have my knee drained, which was preferable. But so that was another 2-ring battle royal and everything in goddamn Altoona, and it didn't draw. And then July 25th, we were in Wilmington, North Carolina, except I was still off. It didn't draw. July 26th was Jacksonville, Florida. And I've scratched it off, and there's not even a report in Graham Cawthon's history book that they actually had that show. So I don't know what the fuck. But Jacksonville had done between $66,000 and $113,000 every year in July, and it didn't. July 27th, I rejoined the boys in Tallahassee for a lackluster show in front of no people. We got a $300 payoff. Orlando was the next day, same thing. Don't even have a house recorded, but we got a $300 payoff. Tampa was the next day. I think they were just giving guys at our level arbitrarily $300 payoffs, because the following day, July 30th, we were in Miami and got another $300 payoff. And then our contract payment was $2,500. So basically, we were $2,500 short of our contract money just over that 2-week period. If it shows you, and that was on the reduced contracts, not even the big ones that we had before. So the entire pay structure was fucked up. Nobody was motivated. They were seeing these towns that if they were promoted properly, and if they hadn't seen all this horse shit, and just if everything I said hadn't happened, would be drawing, and they're not. And July 31st was New Orleans at the Downtown Auditorium, which was a TV taping. And goddamn, I didn't even mark down they paid us for that. What the fuck? They may have got us. I may have to write fucking Turner Broadcasting about this from 1989. And Baton Rouge the next day was a TV taping. And then the next day, August 2nd, was an Atlanta TV taping. And then we went to Little Rock on August 3rd, the old Barton Coliseum, the Midnight Express versus the Freebirds in a main town of Mid-South Wrestling, among others, including at that point, still Terry Funk and Sting and et cetera, $22,000. Kansas City did $18,000. St. Louis don't even have a house. We got a $300 payoff. And then finally, the finish of the Bash season that year was Atlanta at the Omni. War Games. Midnight Express, Dr. Death, and the Road Warriors versus the Samoans and the Freebirds, Gordy Hayes and Garvin. Atlanta in 1986 had done a $185,000 house at Fulton County Stadium. In 87, the first War Games had done $245,000. In 88, for whatever reason, there was not a show in Atlanta during the Bashes. But in 89, and this was the best they could muster of the whole month besides the Bash, or the whole period, $89,000. Less than 8,000 people in the Omni in Atlanta for that War Games, plus Luger versus Steiner, Eddie Gilbert and Scott Steiner against the Great Muta and Kevin Sullivan, blah, blah, blah. So, tickets were 12, 10, and 7. So they may have gotten a $10 average there. So maybe 8,500, 9,000 people. But that was that they took a tour where we literally grossed in the millions of dollars at live events across the country in a 1 month or 6 week period, and turned it into a bunch of TV tapings and 2 good houses. And they didn't even run Johnson City or Norfolk or Jacksonville or Greensboro or goddamn, whatever the fuck. Pittsburgh, they didn't run. Pittsburgh was $142,000 in 87, $80,000 at 88. But that is, and basically right after that, that's when Flair said enough is enough. And as he was coming back to the cards, he wanted to be more in control, because he didn't want to fucking flop that bad also. And to be honest, the houses, I say the house shows never came back. The house shows intermittently would do good here and there, but he wasn't booking he was booking the cards, but he wasn't booking the tour. When you're going to Carbondale, Illinois, there's only so much you can fucking do, right? And so when he got back for the program with Funk, which they both showed so much fucking dedication on, that revived at least the atmosphere somewhat, but still it was hard to draw a house. Charlotte only did with Flair and Funk in August only did 6,000 people, but still that show was goddamn twice as good as the one that they just had before. Oh, and there's a note here also. The same day they ran Charlotte in August was the day that the WCW Saturday Night Show was a replay of the show from 3 weeks before, because they couldn't find the fucking tape, and they couldn't find it until 45 minutes after the old show had gone off the air. So they owned the company, and they owned the TV station that ran the program that they paid to produce, and they still couldn't air the right fucking show.
Let me ask you this. You've just detailed, in great detail, several months of Turner-owned WCW and all the problems with it. In that period of time, let alone the period of time where you were on the booking committee, what did they actually do right? What actually improved from Crockett Promotions, if anything, that they did do?
Well, you got your money up front. That was an improvement. Even though, as I said, it was once the guys found out they didn't have to earn it, and it didn't matter what the show. Then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, well, it ain't gonna draw anyway. Why kill yourself? You know, except for some of the guys, obviously, who were motivated, but some were not. What they had more. I'm trying to figure out a way to say this. There was just more professionalism in terms of they actually did, especially old Chip Burnham, who was one of the office representatives that would check up, and he'd come in and he'd have a big smile on his face. We're all sitting there like fucking Easter Sunday that time we were in San Antonio in a 16,000 seat building with 800 people, and we're sitting there, and Chip would come in. Anybody want to draw? You know, you know, they dealt with the guys more like they were stars, but that's the problem. Sometimes they dealt with you. You got treated a little nicer, but then again, then people started abusing that. I don't think the TVs were they washed it. They cleaned it up too much. The whole appeal of the NWA style of wrestling was that it was grittier, more realistic, more violent, and trying to, well, in the Midnight Express book was that famous memo that they put out from Turner Broadcasting Standards, where they didn't like that Funk put the plastic bag over Flair's head, and they didn't want, and the other guy got his arm broken with a branding iron. Well, yes. Imagine what Dusty had a broken body part 9 months out of the fucking year from something the heels had done to him. So they said, we don't want gratuitous violence. And my caption in the Midnight Express book was, TBS sends out a memo banning gratuitous violence from a program about gratuitous violence. They washed and cleaned up and sanitized the house shows where everything was just it, and the ding dongs, and it started to look like WWF light. And our audience didn't like the WWF to begin with, and if they did, they watched both. But the feedback we always got was, we love this shit because it looks like you guys are mad, et cetera, et cetera. So they changed the in-ring style. They changed the look. As I mentioned, the programs not only didn't have the passion and the emotion from the fans, but they did so many TV tapings and so much canned bullshit and started post-producing and started taping shit out of sequence. And so a lot of times by 90, except for Center Stage, which was downtown Atlanta and was the best free babysitting in fucking town. So they got rowdy crowds. The difference in the TV crowds from 86 and 87 to 90, by 90, the people are just sitting on their hands for a lot of the matches going, what the fuck? We don't even understand. The promotion of the live events, as I said, was lackluster. It just, the talent decisions in some cases. And we mentioned in the program with the Midnight Express versus Brian Pillman and Z-Man, and I hate to speak ill of the dead, but Tom Zink was the highest paid fucking guy in the ring. What's wrong with that picture? It was insulting in a lot of cases, because once they started signing these guaranteed contracts, that's when guys started really being jealous of each other. The guys in the old days were jealous in a good way, like, I'll work harder and I'll get that fucking top spot because he's making so much money, I want to be where he is, but you didn't just resent the fucking guy. But when all of a sudden you've got guys that are sitting home making six figures because they're so fucking non-talented that the new booker doesn't want them on the TV rather than putting guys over. Or you have, a guy like Bobby Eaton, who 15 guys on the roster, including guys who are not nearly the worker nor are not nearly the draw, are making more money than, because some fucking idiot thinks that they look good and they're 8x10. Everything fell apart. The sense of family and this is ours, it's us against them fell apart, where it was always the Crockett locker room against the fucking WWF. We know we're better. We can beat these fucking guys, right? We're gonna sell these buildings out. We're gonna get this heat. We're gonna draw these fucking houses. Then under TBS it became, well, these fucking guys can't do anything right, so what the fuck? What difference does it make? Nothing I can do can make any difference. And also, we had the rivalry with Jimmy Crockett. It's like the boys always hated the promoter in some respect, or was mad at the promoter, or didn't like the promoter, or didn't trust the promoter, or whatever. But still, it was a family thing where the Charlotte guys were fighting the guys up north. Then it became everybody in the locker room hated the fucking Turner Broadcasting office with a passion that was paying him all his fucking money, because elsewise it was complete pain in the ass. And everything else was completely fucked up. The only thing we were getting was the checks. So it was it completely turned around. At that point, the only time that we actually enjoyed our jobs, me and the Midnight, were when we were actually, from the time we went out to the ring to the time we came back. A lot of times we didn't even like being in the locker room anymore because there's too much fucking outside influence in there.
Okay, house show, Jim Herd's not there. Who's Jim Herd's biggest stooge in the locker room?
Well, I don't even know that he had any. Because most of the guys on if Chip Burnham heard something or whatever, already but the people that were in the locker room, especially with when Flair was the booker, me and Kevin were on the team, Wahoo's an agent, etc. Everybody was fine, but Herd would get his news from Barnett would have sources. And they would primarily pay attention around the TV tapings. And of course, there was as many TV tapings almost as there was house shows anyway. So, but in some cases, I think Herd was just oblivious about a lot of the shit was going on, or elsewise he wouldn't have put up with some of it.
This is less than a year after the Turner purchase. When they first made the purchase, and I'm sure everyone's trying to look at this as a positive thing before things quickly went off the tracks. What did you think they would be the most helpful with, having them as the owner of the company?
Well, obviously the checks, and not only the television clearances, because Turner Broadcasting had inroads in syndication also. I didn't know that they would marginalize the syndication and pretty much phase it out. And of course, Vince was setting a precedent that, you had to pay for it. But I really thought they'd put more into local television because that's what sold the tickets to the house shows, but they didn't give a shit about that. But I knew it'd be great for pay-per-view because who's going to turn Turner Broadcasting down to be on a pay-per-view? And I also knew that I would think they'd be able to make money with the syndicated television revenue that Crockett couldn't. So that just anytime you're owned by the guy that owns the TV station, if you can't never lose your television, there's always some hope. But what happened eventually, they lost their fucking television. That's the whole reason Bischoff ended up not buying the thing to begin with. I thought that as long as Turner Broadcasting owned the wrestling company, we would always have not only television, but strong television and big pay-per-view. But I didn't realize that they would – I just never thought until I saw it happen. We didn't have that long, couple months to think about it, that they would actually hire people to run the wrestling company that had never fucking had anything to do with wrestling. And that it was possible. I'd never seen business crash like that anywhere. I didn't know it was possible to fucking bring something that was fairly successful for that long a period of time to a fucking almost dead standstill within a couple months period of time. But they pretty much did it. And that's and the constant turnover. Even Flair had the book from late August or mid-August to the following February when he quit. Then they went back to another committee. But then they appointed, maybe it was Ole or maybe it was Dusty that was next. But Herd was still always over who the booker was. And I had a talk, as we've told the story before. Dusty called me to come back in 91, but I was setting up Smoky Mountain, and I knew I was, and I didn't trust Herd. So I gave him other reasons that I didn't want to come back, because I didn't want to lie to him. But if it had been Dusty running the company, I might have come back, but not Dusty being the booker and Herd running the company. And then they got Hurd finally quit. Then they got Kip Fry, and he hired other bookers and blah, blah, blah. There was easily from November 88 to just 94, when Bischoff started getting the most influence, there was easily, 9 or 10 different booking regimes, average of at least 2 a year. And it's just a fucking mess. It's just a fucking mess. But I don't think you can understate it, that they wiped it down and cleaned it up so it would look like WWF wrestling, which it removed the appeal that we had that the WWF couldn't replicate, is that there's no way that they can make their shit look as fucking real as ours. So that was the one thing that we had going for us. I figure if they don't fuck with the product, which we've just proven, we're just selling buildings out 2 months ago. So give us more money, give us full fucking television coverage and full pay-per-view coverage, and don't change the only shit we've got that works, the talent and the product. And that's the first thing they changed. So I don't know what to tell you.
Well, the geniuses from Turner Broadcasting.
I mean, it just, everything just fucking, you can't, there wasn't one thing, but as you just asked me, well, what did they do better than Crockett? Well, our Crockett's house show gates were on average bigger. The matches were more well received. The TV ratings under a lot of the period were better. The wrestlers made more money on some of them on payoffs than we did on contracts.
When did you first see a makeup person backstage?
Oh God. The makeup, man, that's, by the way, we love you, Terry Runnels. That's how she got started. But they started with makeup as soon as January 89-ish, because here's the thing, the hairstylist came first. What was his fucking name? I want to say something like Jay Tapper or something. But he was this gay hairstylist, not that there's anything wrong with that, from St. Louis. And they would fly, and that was one of the things that the boys would go on and on about. Jim Hurd bought this fucking hairstylist a plane ticket from St. Louis to come over and do the boys' hair before the Clash of Champions. So there was makeup and hair people there, and that's when we're looking at empty buildings. And everybody's just making their fucking minimum on their contract, but we're looking at their flying in fucking haircuts from St. Louis.
You ever realize that era? I noticed it recently when I went back and watched some footage. Paul Heyman has like the Donald Trump orange hue.
Because he always went to get makeup.
You could tell.
He did. I won't say I never. They would, when JR and I were the commentary team for a lot of the clashes, which that was another thing Flair did. And to be honest, everybody says, well, you're on Flair's side. Well, what the fuck? Not only did he put me on my first booking job, but he put me and JR as the announce team for all the Clash of Champions. And so for heaven's sake, but every once in a while, if they would corner me and just make me, I'd do it. And I'd say, just give me some powder or whatever the fuck. Because I hate that shit. I did it very little in the WWF. I didn't do it at the Hall of Fame. I ducked them at the Hall of Fame. But I've always hated to wear makeup, so only when I was absolutely forced would I have the lightest powder possible. Paul Lee would stand in line at the fucking chair to get makeup. I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? He's like, well, I don't.
He had more makeup than Muda on some of these television tapings.
But yeah, I mean, that's once again, yes, it just penny wise and pound foolish, and putting their, and then by then, what was it, 90, I guess they'd pretty much, hadn't they killed Baltimore by 90, which was the last one that they hadn't killed? Because, hold on, let me just look this up here, and I'll just tell you.
Obviously, Bash 90 was in Baltimore. That's when Sting won the title from Ric Flair.
Yes, but I'm talking about
maybe the last great Midnight Express match of that era.
No, it actually wasn't. You know when the last great Midnight Express match was?
No.
The last pay-per-view we did, Halloween Havoc, you go back and watch Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane versus Ricky Morton and Tommy Rich in the opening match and tell me that that's not the best, if you're applying it to a current standard, not the best tag team match you've seen in about 6 months, except if the Revival was involved. All of our big show matches were good. That's where we got out our frustrations. Because we didn't physically attack Jim Herd because we could go out and tear the house down and give him a middle finger on the TV show. As long as our match was either the best one on the show or next to Flair's, then we were happy and we could give fucking Herd a finger. That's why all those matches that year were so good. But okay, I'm going to 80 in Baltimore for 90, 8,900 people paid. Didn't even sell out the goddamn building. So they had started to kill, and I think the house was, it probably was 6 figures or whatever. I don't have it written down here, but the point is, the Baltimore, D.C. area in 1986, Washington, D.C. at the Armory had done 135 grand, and Baltimore had done 106. In 87, Landover, Maryland had done 195 grand, and Baltimore 146 grand in the same month, and they're 30 miles apart. So that's 30-something thousand fucking fans. In 88, Landover, Maryland did 157,000 and Baltimore did 206,000. And in 89, Baltimore still did a $188,000 house and sold out almost 13,000 people or whatever. By 90, they didn't run Landover and Baltimore didn't do 9,000 paid. So
what about the talent turnover when the Flair booking committee took over? I remember when you think about Bash 89, the pay-per-view at least, and the 2-ring battle royal, there are a lot of guys out there that you don't see for too much longer. Scott Hall is one of the guys walking out there, and he was gone pretty quick.
Yeah, and I don't know that there wasn't anything personal there. I mean, Scott Hall wasn't anybody at that period of time, but he would come back later on because he was somebody that would work for fucking cheaper at that period of time. But Flair just tried to eliminate some of the excess and just concentrate on the guys we want to use and had to have enough guys to get them over. Because that way, there weren't bad feelings from people. Because remember one time that the original Kevin Kelly, who was Nails, came in and had a tryout at Center Stage, and it wasn't very good, and he did adequate promo, if that, and Flair didn't see anything in him. So the guy calls back about 2 weeks later, and Flair says, well, to be honest with you, Kevin, we just don't have any spots right now. We're full. And the guy said, fire somebody. I need a job. Like you were going to fire somebody for his fucking ass. It is so, anyway, he tried to keep it down and polish it a little bit to where that there weren't extraneous guys. But once again, you always had heard, well, if not the ding dongs, what about the hunchbacks or the goddamn, whatever the fuck. And it see,
the ding dongs is so offensive. The ding dongs is so offensive because it doesn't make any sense. Even if you said, well, the WWF has stuff aimed for children, we should have a children's gimmick, you would come up with something that there's a reasonable thought process that would lead you to think someone would get behind, that a child would go, yeah. The ding dongs, it's like the lamest excuse. Let's just create the ding dongs and they'll have bells and they'll, ding and dong. It's just, there's no thought at all behind that.
Well,
I know I'm preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, I'm just telling you.
Were there plans to do more with Dick Slater when he was there for the Clash in September of '89, the notorious plastic bag incident? Did you guys plan to do more with Dick Slater?
Because that's right when I was starting. I think that they would have, and I can't remember what happened, why they didn't, to be quite honest. Why did Slater leave? Well, here now you've stumped me.
And then when did you guys start hearing, because I think Wyndham didn't return until right as the booking committee, right as Flair was leaving as booker, but there had been a lot of stuff going on. He was supposed to be in a Survivor Series, and then he wasn't. He was supposed to be in the Royal Rumble, and then he wasn't. This is right when Blackjack and Kendall obviously were having all their legal issues. But when did you know Wyndham was coming back? Was that something that Flair had been trying to put together?
Because we were trying to find horsemen, right? And so, of course, he had been talking to everybody. And then I don't know whether when they passed, Barry had great timing. He was He was either coming in or there when Dusty was his mentor and father figure was leaving. He was trying to come in to work for Ric Flair, and Ric Flair they pass in the night. I don't remember how much time elapsed, but yeah, it was in the works. And Flair just, because Rick makes quick decisions. When he just got fed up, because he called me that day and he said, "Well, I'm faxing in my resignation." I'm like, "Oh fuck." Because I knew here it goes. It's downhill from here. And it was. But it was like with, just a couple of days decision.
I never asked you this before, and I'm sure there's nothing there, but Flair versus Pillman is one of the matches on the AWA Big Show in early 1990. The AWA was going down, but they were still on TV. They still had TV. Did you guys talk at all with Greg Gagne or anyone about trying to do something? I'm sure they were looking for people to help them, but there was at least something because Flair and Pillman was on that show. Was there any talk with the AWA?
That would have been done around or over the top of me. But see, that's the thing. Who knows? There may try to have been, but it would have gone through Herd or Barnett and Herd. I didn't hear anything at the time about any great cooperative opportunities.
I know you, obviously, with great respect, still roll your eyes at just maybe the behavior of Jim Barnett and how him being in the mix here wasn't very helpful at times. But did anyone else feel that way?
I think, it's Jim Barnett, right? So it's like you're on a baseball team. There's Babe Ruth, so there was that. But I think everybody pretty much realized at that point he either lost it, didn't have it, didn't want it, or didn't want to argue with Jim Herd. It was my thought process. Because once again, you had people that had sold out in the wrestling business for several generations, all under one roof, and they couldn't figure out how to get lunch. So it wasn't it was the sum of the parts, not the parts. A lot of the parts were great in other parts. It just none of it worked, and it was just such a fuck up. And after Flair quit as Booker, we talked about this on one of the kayfabe commentaries I did not long ago. But after Flair quit as Booker, he was still the champion, and he'd promised he was going to drop the belt to Sting. But Herd got mad at him and wanted to take the belt off of him and put it on Luger. So at a house show in Chicago, like in March of 90, it's like a month after Flair quit as Booker, they send announcers, a film crew, the whole 9 yards. They walk into fucking Chicago and, "What are you guys doing?" "Well, we're shooting you dropping the belt to fucking Luger." And he's like, "No, I'm not." How do you think that a fucking, especially Flair of all people, but any champion in those days, especially with what had gone on between him and Jim Herd, he sees the film crew walk in to shoot his title loss is how he finds out about the title loss? So he said, "No, I promised it Sting. I'm dropping it Sting in Baltimore this July, like we said." Because that's when Sting was fucking hurt and fucked up his knee and he couldn't wrestle. So Herd would try to fuck with Flair. Flair would turn around and start fucking back with Herd, and nothing would get done.
Isn't that part of the problem? You say Flair made very quick decisions. Herd did the same thing.
Yeah, but his were generally stupid.
Right, no, but just the idea that the guys had a very similar trait. Naturally, they butted heads. One did things in a reasonable way, even though he was Ric Flair, and one of them did things in a stupid way, and that was St. Louis's own Jim Herd.
Yes. And but anyway, that you can't point at one thing, as we've said, as to the reason why that it just didn't fucking work. And it wasn't going to work. And it didn't work from 1988, WCW under Turner Broadcasting, until 1996, 8 years, when the entire business had changed. The whole way to make money in the business had changed. And then, and then they found the accidental angle and got hot and then couldn't keep it and then went under. So when you think about it, on a much smaller scale, 88 through 90 was kind of like 99 through 2001 for the modern WCW. They lost tons more, tens of millions of dollars the second time around, but they had something hot, and the people running it couldn't figure out how to keep it hot, and they had several key things fucked up at the same time, and boom, and bad booking. So even though that we thought from 88 through 90, I've never seen something die like this quick. They really beat themselves. They're the only company that ever did that twice in the history of wrestling. They beat themselves with it 10 years later. From 99 to 2001 was a much more drastic drop because they had gotten so much higher finally, and then they dropped so much lower that they just said, fuck it, and folded up. Same company twice in the same fucking decade.
House show business dropped. It wouldn't recover until the Monday Night Boom. They even stopped running house shows at a certain point, and they just did television tapings. Smoky Mountain Wrestling, notoriously, famously, as one promoter bragged about, outdrew WCW regularly during this period of time. I am curious what you think if, let's just say Bill Watts had another 6 months and you had been able to do, it wasn't really a Smoky Mountain invasion as much as the heels from Smoky Mountain were invading, and the Smoky Mountain commissioner was very understanding with WCW, so it wasn't a full invasion. But do you think that would have done, at that time in 93, that would have been able to actually do some business at house shows? I'm not saying sell out Norfolk, but do you think it would have picked things up?
No. And part of it, Watts needed more time because, once again, you can't turn the Titanic on a dime. Watts needed more time, and also people didn't understand what he was trying to do because at that point, he didn't realize that it's not that people had gotten smarter, it's that people had gotten stupider about wrestling. And when he came in, he honestly thought, I think, that people understood what he was trying to do, but even the boys in the business couldn't figure it out, and therefore they didn't want to give him time to do it, or it'd have been better for everybody. But I don't even know whether he could have resurrected the house show business at that point, and that had been 4 years or whatever it had been. It was a while after Herd. But the Smoky Mountain relationship would have been more of an early version of developmental. The only people in Smoky Mountain that were going to pop a rating or any kind of pay-per-view buy rate or whatever just by appearing were either the Rock and Roll Express or me and the Heavenly Bodies because of our history. That's why I suggested that match, pitched it to get my foot in the door on the thing. And because I told Watts, this is my exact words, I said, those fucking morons that you're working for down there just spent $50,000 on a goddamn movie where a midget blows up a boat to sell a pay-per-view. Nobody knows what the fuck's going on. I said, you give me half that, and I will not only give you the top babyface tag team of the predecessor company that you're now running that drew the biggest gates and ratings, but I will give you another team close to the Midnight Express that I manage against them, and the angle and execution of same on pay-per-view, all for half the money they spent on the fucking, and that's how I got the $25,000. But we would have been able to, like we got Arn Anderson, we would have been able to get some, and we got Bobby for a little while. We would have been able to get some of their talent for a limited period of time. Let's say if they were changing somebody's gimmick or somebody had been out injured and wanted to get back in ring shape, then Watts could send them to me for 2 weeks or a month, and I could use them and figure them into my big shows to enhance my local full-time talent. And maybe there would be spots on pay-per-view where my guys could go down there and be involved in something that didn't just make them look like, local yokels. Or as when I sent Paul Orndorff down there because Paul had been working for me, and Watts called me. That's how we started talking and said, how's Paul work? He drew a lot of money for me. I know he's been hurt. How's he looking? I'd like to bring him in down here. I said, he's been fucking great, and he looks fantastic, and his work is impeccable, and I'd love for you to take him and give him some bookings because I can't pay him anymore. I've used him up, and he's my highest paid guy. So it was easy to do business with Watts, and that's the way it would have been. It wasn't that there was just going to suddenly be Smoky Mountain Championship matches on all the fucking, WCW pay-per-views or whatever. Part of it was more that, and also if I found a Paul Orndorff that he wanted, or as later on what I did with, there was a reason why that so many guys went from from Smoky Mountain to the WWF, because I was sending them. If I'd have been working with WCW, I'd have been trying to send people there to keep them away from the WWF. But I did the same thing to send them to the WWF and keep them away from WCW because that was the arrangement. So you would a satellite territory would funnel guys that they could develop, and then once you're finished with them, fucking, hey, you want to take this hot new heel I've got, Chris Candido? He's a hell of a kid. He can work with all your fucking cruiserweights or whatever the fuck, right? It wouldn't have been a deal where we were presented as necessarily a competing promotion on their television or one that was equivalent in size or strength or whatever. But and also WCW wouldn't run fucking house shows in Knoxville and Johnson City. Because why would a promotion I'm working with be running fucking against me? That was agreed to. Things like that, stuff that you could deal with Watts because he understood how the wrestling business was supposed to fucking work.
Going back to Bash 89, the topic here, it is widely considered one of the greatest wrestling pay-per-view events of all time. From the moment it happened to this day, it's still considered one of the very best, and it holds up.
Yes.
I'm curious what you felt right after it. I mean, you had a hurt knee, but you still had maybe the greatest tuxedo match of all time because it actually made sense. It wasn't a complete embarrassment. And that's like
being the nicest guy in prison. You had the greatest tuxedo match of all time.
You were also at ringside for the War Games. When that pay-per-view ends, what's the general feeling? Is it, this company, or is it, we did a really great show. Maybe something good will come out of it.
It was a great show, and I think everybody was happy, and it was a sellout. And there's still life in this horse. We can do it, and I think that's what motivated. As I said, that's what motivated Flair to say, "Okay, I've got the leverage now, and we can stop this fucking bleeding." And I was happy because me and Paulie didn't embarrass ourselves. And even though my knee was fucked up, I didn't have to go to Altoona. And I remember, as a matter of fact, my wife was in town. So me and her went with Eddie Gilbert and Missy Hyatt to fucking Sabatino's because I was in Baltimore and I'd been looking forward. I believe I mentioned that goddamn string that we spent in fucking, West Texas and up in Massachusetts. I'd been looking forward to going to Sabatino's. So even though by the time I got finished with that match, I couldn't bend my knee and I could barely walk, I went to fucking Sabatino's because I was like, fuck it. They can't drain it till tomorrow. So whatever I do now ain't going to make any difference. And, everybody was up and happy. But that was the problem, is that a show like that, especially because it was the ultimate angle, take Flair away from him and then bring him back in fucking recurring heroes role, etc. Everybody was up because of that show, but there was still going to be the daily problems of Jim Herd being a fucking moron and fucking things up, and constant, misery and revolving door, fucking bullshit from all the other aspects of the business. So, but, we knew we could still put a fucking show on.
I know we're running late. Just a couple more questions, I promise.
Oh, I'm all right.
The rumor's always been that Eddie Gilbert was originally scheduled to turn heel on Sting at Bash 89. You weren't on the booking committee yet, but do you know anything about how true that is?
I have not actually even heard that, I don't think. So, what did... Let me find the card here. What did Eddie do on Bash 89?
He was in the Battle Royal, and he escorted Sting to the ring for the match with Muta.
Well, I don't know. I'm sure Eddie probably wanted to turn heel. He always liked being a heel much better. But we talked about this was before Flair was the booker. So I don't know whether there was ill feelings between Eddie and Rick before that, or whether it was kind of simultaneous with Rick taking the book. Because, to be honest, when he took the book over, Eddie was on the committee. Rick suddenly became Eddie's boss. Whereas I'm sure Eddie had fucking sights on wanting to book the whole thing himself, because he'd been crazy if he didn't have sights on it. Because back in those days, you could have gotten away with stuff like that. But so I'm sure he probably wanted to do it, but Flair just outranked him.
What was that dynamic like, considering Eddie had been on a booking committee and his wife at the time, Missy Hyatt, was on TV, although she certainly was not being used to her full potential because she was such a great character that was just never used properly after 1988. But then also you have Kevin Sullivan on the committee before Flair and the committee with Flair, and he has his wife, Nancy, woman, who is now being introduced on TV and would eventually become that lead heel, vixen, valet manager for a while. What about that dynamic? The fact that you had two guys on the committee and one guy getting kicked off the committee, and they both had wives in the mix.
Well, and see, I didn't come in till after Eddie left, and we've told that story. I took his spot, but I was not sitting in his chair when he came in one day. They had told him ahead of time. But, Rick wanted me on the committee, and he didn't want Eddie on the committee. But by the time that I got there, since Eddie was not on anymore, Missy tended to work her gimmick a little bit outside the ring as well in those days, and she had her fans and she had her detractors, or how they wanted to use her and in what way, and etc. I'm like you, Missy Hyatt with the Gucci purse in fucking Mid-South and UWF was the thing I would have always have done. But Kevin never mentioned Nancy's name. It wasn't like he was pushing her. Everybody was knocked out by Nancy. She was gorgeous, and she was talented, and she knew the business, and she wasn't pushy and never had, an issue that I knew of with doing anything or whatever the fuck. But it was something that, and actually Rick, that's why Rick ended up putting Nancy with him for a little while there right before this run as Booker was over with, because she looked like a main event talent valet. She looked like if some woman was going to be ringside with a horseman, it looked like Nancy would be the woman. But Kevin didn't push her to do shit. I think he more or less talked her into it because he wanted to get the Steiner thing over, because he liked those guys, because Rick had been in the varsity club. So it wasn't that wasn't difficult. What was difficult was having a committee inside a committee. Because, as Terry Funk said, too many cooks and not enough stew. The committee, when Flair was the booker, the committee inside the committee was Rick, me, and Kevin Sullivan. And then the committee outside the committee was Jody Hamilton, who worked in the office and booked the job guys and et cetera, and was a wrestling legend, so he could certainly have input. And Jim Barnett, who was there to agree with anything that Herd wanted, and Jim Herd. And then Jim Ross, who was caught in the middle of everything because he had to work in the office, but he was really talent, whereas the other people were just straight office people. So he was kind of caught in the middle. And that's what Herd would cause him and Flair to get JR and Flair to get mad at each other. But at the time, the fewer people that can be doing everything, the better. That's why Flair's tenure worked, because he gave us the direction. Kevin filled in a lot of blanks. I did the paperwork. And that was it. That was where we were going. The only time we had problems was when we had to sit with the outside committee, which was every fucking body else, and listen to Jim Herd drone on and argue about shit incessantly. So the booking meetings with everybody accomplished nothing. And then me and Rick and Kevin would do whatever in the car. That's probably why that was the most successful booking run for the first 5 or 6 years, because every other time it was committees and they were expected to do shit in the office. Or it was Ole, who pretty much was over it at that point. I love Ole Anderson's booking from the 70s and 80s, but they were never allowed to work. Never allowed. There was always too many people with their hand in the shit.
And then my last question is, you and I have talked in the past on the show about the misuse of Brian Pillman and how, he was really just this bright young star, and he never hit his full potential, especially in those first couple of years, because he was just from one booker to another, from Jim Barnett's opinion to whoever else's opinion. It was herky-jerky. He never really got to hit his full potential. The other young guy I think of from the summer of '89 is Muta, who just got over. He was so over with me as a kid. And I'm just curious, because he would leave at the beginning of 1990. Did you guys ever have any dealings with Muta that Gary Hart wasn't involved in? I mean, we always hear about Paul Ellery,
No.
the actual manager of the Road Warriors. Was Gary Hart in Muta's ear about every single thing going on? And do you think there's anything that you guys could have done to keep Muta?
Well, here's the thing. That's what I was told. Oh, I didn't come out. Once again, I didn't want to get in other people's business, but what I was told was that Gary had convinced Muta, brother, it'll kill you off if they switch you babyface. Because everybody wanted to switch it. This is one thing we actually agreed with Herd on. This guy will be a tremendous babyface. The kids will love him. He's flashy and exciting. At the right time and doing it in the right way, we should turn him babyface. But Gary saw that and, well, where the fuck would I be? And he knew what the fuck was going. So he convinced Muta, oh, I brought her to kill you if they switch you babyface. That's why Muta didn't want to fucking do it, and ended up, he went back to Japan, and of course he had obviously options there, but he did not want to be a babyface. Pillman, if Rick had not quit, I think what would have happened as Booker, what would have happened in 91 was they would have put the belt on Sting because he promised, and that's the way they wanted to go. And then about 6 months later, it wouldn't have worked, and they'd have put it back on Flair because he would have still been the Booker, and he's all right, and then he would have put it on Pillman. Because he wanted to work with Brian. That's why the Saturday night show in February that did the highest rating under the TBS first 6 years or 7 years of their ownership for the Saturday night show was Flair versus Pillman. He had specifically said, I want 2 main events that week. On Saturday night, I'm going to work with Brian Pillman. And on Sunday, it's going to be the Rock and Roll Express returning against Flair and Arn. And they did 4.0 on Saturday night, 4.4 on Sunday. I know. I wrote the formats. I still have them in hand. He loved Brian, and that's why I instigated the angle with the Midnight Express after we'd switched heel finally with the Dynamic Dudes, because that was the only other team that hated so bad that he didn't care what we did. That's the only reason I got to work with them. We started the thing with Pillman and Zink so that we would end up making Brian Pillman the star of the angle and reveal his throat operations after we'd injured him and how courageous he was. And in the end, Pillman, we'd get rid of Zink somehow, but Pillman would come back and beat the Midnight Express single-handed and get his hands on me and get his revenge on me, and then be ready to be a top single guy because Flair loved working with him so much and the rating was so great. Well, yes, but then once Flair quit as Booker and everybody starts going a different direction, the match in May at Capital Combat where Pillman and Zink lost the U.S. title back to the Midnight Express was supposed to have been where Pillman would have got even with all of us, and he lost the fucking match. So nothing that started ever finished properly, and it was a fucking mess. But Pillman would have been a champion within a year, I bet, as a single, if Flair had stayed with the book.
Well, speaking of things that don't finish properly, here we are on the Experience, Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, we didn't start or finish properly. Well, there you go. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Another look down wrestling memory lane at how bad you can fuck things up when you really try. And maybe this has been a cautionary tale, Brian. Maybe some people will learn now that there's some things that you can do to wrestling to really fuck it up. We've done over the past few months on the program, as I said, with the kids say, the deep dives, right? Where we would talk about WCW at various points, either starting with Crockett and the Great American Bash tours and branching to when TBS bought the company, the changes in booking and scheduling and all the things that kind of Dusty had somewhat got the gates back with the booking of the Bash 88, and some of the towns were strong. And then the last one we did was how quickly it fell apart and how that the Great American Bash 89 was a horrible follow-up to 86, 87, 88 as far as a tour. But people fondly remember the pay-per-view because it was the one really good show of the whole month. I think that's where we kind of left it, right? Well, I realized it actually, because I haven't even thought about this, and it's one of my favorite matches, but nobody ever, I won't say nobody, but we hadn't mentioned that there was one more Great American Bash series that I was a part of. But nobody mentions the tour because when I look back on it, I cannot decide whether they even billed it as a Great American Bash on tour in 1990, or did they just call the pay-per-view that? Because, I mean, they downplayed the tour in 89, but was there even, because I don't see anything special in the way of fucking gates, and I don't see any, big advertising. Do you remember, did they even call it a tour?
I don't remember it being called a tour.
Well, it shouldn't have been. I'm just telling you, here's the thing. We kind of got a false sense of security, as we mentioned in '89, when Flair got the book, and the quality of the matches definitely went up, and of course, and Funk was working his ass off, and etc. The ratings went up. This is from fall '89 to February of '90. The ratings were up. The pay-per-views were doing well. The house shows were still very hard, as I think I recall mentioning that they never really got the house shows, but they were still running house shows, unlike in like 3 or 4 when they didn't even run any. But once again, they had taken a company that was going out and grossing 6 figures in the month of July, grossing 6 figures in a dozen different towns and other gates, large gates in other towns, to where in 1989 they'd really just done the sellout in Baltimore for the pay-per-view and $188,000 house, and they did $89,000 in Atlanta. That was the highlights of the month. In 1990, they had suffered through, once that Flair quit in February, and it was a couple weeks later I quit. And that's the point where they went back to a committee, I believe. And we might have to get somebody like Brian Alvarez or Dave Meltzer on the program that have specific dates of when everything. But I think they were doing a committee for a couple months, and then they brought Ole back. And Ole was, once again, charming everyone with his, sunny disposition. And we got once again, some good and some bad, in that Ole immediately brought guys like Stan Hansen back and tried to get some of the talent that he had relationships with, but at the same time was doing some really weird things, booking, possibly just because he was more likely to have done what Jim Herd asked him to do without fucking arguing with him. Because, all right, you're the fucking boss. I don't give a shit what anybody thinks about me. I'm making the same amount of money. If you want to goddamn do something fucking stupid, I'll write it fucking right here. There you go. I can see him doing that. Right? So who knows? I don't fucking know, right? I wasn't in the office at that point anyway, but I wanted to just go back to like May of 1990 and give you some of the highlights of what we did for the couple of months leading up to what traditionally was the biggest grossing month by far in the company that they had just bought, where they were drawing up to 25,000 people in fucking outdoor stadium shows just 4 years earlier. And still running stadium shows and drawing upwards of that 2 years earlier. And see what they had instead come up with after, once again, another couple booking changes and et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I go back to May is because at that point we had just agreed to sign our new contracts, me and the Midnight Express. And I've told a story before. You can find it on YouTube. That basically Wahoo McDaniel came into Norfolk, Virginia, or Hampton, Virginia, and announced to us when we thought we were finishing up that no, indeed, all of the agents and all of everybody on the booking committee universally voted that we should all have contracts renewed and overruled Jim Herd. And so he said, okay, and we're getting our new contracts. And we immediately got fucking pissed because we were all looking forward to leaving. So it was May or April that happened, and May that we actually signed our contracts. That I wanted to tell this story real quick as this lead up to this 2 months of fucking ineptitude. First, on May the 4th, they were going to try to fucking invade the Northeast and run where Vince runs, right? Again, in Boston. But May 4th, WCW did not run the Boston Garden like Vince used to at the time. They ran the Walter Brown Arena at a fucking college somewhere in fucking Boston somewhere, which is all I know that I remember about it. Except that me and Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton and Dutch Mantell had the rental car from the airport and finally found this place. And we were all nearly killed when the cop said, go down to the next light and take a left. And that's the parking lot behind the college. And we're in downtown somewhere. The left was a one-way street. Well, I figured, he told me to, so I can at least claim that. So I'm turning left down the wrong one-way street to go in this parking lot, catty-cornered. And as I'm halfway in the median to wait for the traffic to stop to turn left, we realize that we're sitting on train tracks and there's a fucking train coming down the middle of the goddamn road in this fucking place, right? And now Dutch is trying to get the goddamn seatbelt. He's strapped in the front seat with the seatbelt hooked. He can't get the goddamn seatbelt unhooked. And he's panicking, trying to open the goddamn locked door and get the seatbelt off of him so he can jump out and not be hit by the train. But we jump across the road when the traffic clears and didn't get hit by the train. But the show got hit by the train. I don't know how many. I didn't record the house because nobody told it to me. And in the fine book, WCW 1989 to 1994 by Graham Coffin, an old friend of mine, they said there's 1,500 people there, and I doubt it, right? And that was the night where Luger couldn't find the fucking building. But while we got there an hour beforehand because we left early, he didn't get there until 10 o'clock after Steiner was already in the ring to fucking wrestle Flair. Rick Steiner was, when Luger shows up, and they stop the goddamn and take a second intermission while Luger gets dressed because it took him till 10 o'clock to find the fucking building. And he didn't even almost get hit by a fucking train. So now we're in the fucking Northeast, right? We do that show. We get a $250 payoff where actually Johnny Ace of the Dynamic Dudes defeated Bobby Eaton. And Stan Lane defeated Dutch Mantell because other people didn't show up. And so we had to fucking wrestle a guy that rode to the fucking matches in the car with us. Because whoever the fuck else didn't show up. Then the next day, we are off. We are off because we all have to fucking go to Canada, to New Brunswick, not even to the fun part of Canada. There is a little part there. There's out on the West Coast and in the middle, there's a couple of parts of Canada that are fun, but this was New Brunswick. We go to Canada and stay in a fucking hotel, so we start the show the next day. WCW is running Fredericton, New Brunswick. Okay, they can't run Gaffney, South Carolina and draw a fucking house, right? So Stan Lane is so miserable that when we the next day when we're off so that we can travel to fucking the next day to Canada without having to go back to Charlotte first, he cracks up and he flies home, right? He can't take it anymore. Fuck these fucking people. Well, now I'm actually sick already because it's unseasonable weather of some kind, and I've caught a cold. But now I can't fucking call in sick because Stan's already called in sick. So me and Bobby Eaton and Dutch Mantell continue on to fucking New Brunswick. And so Kevin Sullivan fills in for Stan against Bobby against the Road Warriors. We put them over and get another $200 payoff, of course. But we got our contract payment that day. They paid us $3,869 as the balance they owed us on our contracts each over the previous 2 weeks because they were running nothing that was drawing anything and they weren't paying anybody anything. So we have that match that night. And then the next day is when we go to St. John, New Brunswick, and that's where the show was canceled because of the ammonia leak in the ice hockey floor freezing facility. Where we got there and there was a giant line outside and the show was canceled because the ammonia leak inside. It hurt you. It burned your lungs to draw breath inside the building. And the headline the next day in the paper read, wrestling show gassed. And I told Dutch it was a mercy killing. So there was a line for that one. There might have been a good crowd there, but we got paid $200 to sit in a hotel in St. John. Now Stan's decision is starting to look good, right? He's gone home, and I'm so sick now. I've got 102-degree fever or whatever the fuck. We do Halifax, where Bobby has a single match with Animal and gets beat. We got $225 that night. They had to cover the cab. And then we finally get to come back to New York State, where Stan has come back after his 72-hour flu was over with and rejoined the traveling troupe. And I get to go to the athletic commission doctor that night to say, please, can you give me medicine? My temperature was 102 something. I had a fucking fever. I'm coughing. I can't fucking speak. He says, come to my office tomorrow and I'll examine you and give you some antibiotics. So I worked that night. The Midnight Express beats Johnny Ace and the illustrious Johnny Stewart, and we get paid $150 to work Syracuse in front of no fucking people. And I must mention that this is the big tour. This is the A tour. They had a B tour the next day in New Mexico with the Freebirds and the Rock and Roll Express, but this is the A tour that drew like 400 people in goddamn Syracuse. Then the next day in Rochester, I go to the athletic commission doctor. He tells me I'm lucky I don't have pneumonia. He gives me antibiotics and a shot of something. And then Bobby Eaton has the people at Wendy's make me their first ever custom-made quadruple cheeseburger to welcome me back to the United States of America because I'm sick. So in Rochester, we beat Johnny Ace and Johnny Stewart again in front of a $5,300 house, folks. So I guarantee you that was the high 300s or low 400s in the people. And then we go to Saginaw, Michigan. We can't even go to Detroit. We have to go to, like, if they want to give Michigan an enema, they're going to stick the nozzle in Saginaw, right? And we beat Johnny Ace and Johnny Stewart again. We're on the road here, folks. We're traveling now. And that was a $200 payoff as well, because as I remember, it was in the hundreds of people. Oh, then we go to Detroit the next day. And we work with Scott Steiner and Mike Rotunda. Not quite the varsity club. But for whatever reason, Rick was not available. So, and they beat us. And we got $250. I'm sorry, because there was probably only about 1,500 people there.
So that was Captain Mike Rotunda. That was the boat captain version of Mike Rotunda.
Yeah, there you go. And his boat ran over us. And then we go to Chicago the next day, May 13th. And this time, Animal and Mike Rotunda beat us. So the makeshift tag teams. I don't know why Animal was even goddamn teaming with. Oh, wait a minute. I'm looking at because Hawk subbed for Luger, who was out with a staph infection. So that's what happened. So, well, there you go. So the reason why, and that was May 13th in Chicago, and that was another shitty house of about 2,400 people, and we got $300. May 14th, we go to Indianapolis for TV, for the syndicated TV tapings. And that is where that Jim Hurd walked up to us as me and Bobby and Stan after the previous since the 1st of May. We had either for this company been in goddamn, like Rainsville, Alabama was May 1st, right? For TV, in Greenwood, South Carolina, and then a day off. So starting May 4th, we'd been in Boston, New Brunswick. We'd been gassed. We'd been starved. We'd been fucking substituted and beat to death, right? And 10 days later, without getting to go home, we walk into the fucking Indianapolis building and we're headed to the locker room, me and Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, and Hurd's coming the other direction. And he's got an envelope in his hand. And wouldn't you know, it's our contracts. And he walks right up to us and hands me our contracts, the new ones that he's been outvoted over and didn't approve of, and actually says, you know, I was against this. I said, we were too. We were too. We did. That was his management style. That was the charm of the man. After what we'd done the previous 10 days, the first thing he does is make sure that we remember that he didn't want us around. And I made sure that he remembered that we didn't want to be around him. So we do a TV there in Indianapolis, and but where basically Bobby doesn't work, and Brian Pillman beats Stan Lane with a sunset flip on TV. And then we go to Battle Creek, Michigan, against the Rock and Roll Express for $200. And Dayton, same thing the next day. And then we actually get to go home. So they had us on the road for 2 weeks in May doing bullshit, right? But at that same Indianapolis taping, they announced that that's when Ole took over the book. and it had been the committee. Now it's Ole. So the first pay-per-view is coming up 8 days later. That was the return of RoboCop on May 19th in Washington, the DC Armory.
Capital Combat.
Capital Combat. It was such an enjoyable day because there was no air conditioning in the building in a hot day in May in Washington. They started at 7 o'clock, but a lot of the tickets listed 8 o'clock, so people were still coming in an hour after the show fucking started. And so this was a typical WCW production, right? But we were kind of excited because, all right, Ole at that point, we figured Ole has been the booker for a fucking week. He likes guys that can work and, whatever the fuck. So maybe we've got a little better opportunity here, but we've still got the herd problem. So we work with Pillman and Z-Man, Tom Zink. This was supposed to be, when we started it, in Altoona, and they cut it off. The deal was that we were going to end up working with Pillman and Zink, where if Pillman would get his revenge for us injuring his throat, and somehow we would dump Zink in the climactic, part of the thing, but that Pillman would say, fuck it, and he would beat both members of the Midnight Express by himself and then get me in 5 minutes with me, but it wouldn't take him that long, and he'd beat me, and he'd get even, and he'd be a top guy, right? Well, since they hadn't done any of the rest of the fucking angle to lead up to that, Ole just said, fuck it. We had lost the U.S. tag team titles to him. Ole said, fuck it. And he put the Midnight over in the only match we were supposed to lose was the only one we ended up winning. And we won the belts back from him and beat him. So then Brian and Zink just kind of looked like a plate full of piss. But at least we're the champions, right? And then we proceed. And then we beat him the next day on TV in Montgomery, 2 days later in Montgomery, Alabama. And then we proceed to never win really another fucking match. And they were trying to run the Road Warriors off at this point. We worked with the Road Warriors in Ozark, Alabama for $200. They're really running these shows, folks. I'm not ribbing you. That was May 22nd. I think they announced the crowd was 350 people. And so at any rate, that was the Road Warriors last week, May 24th in Memphis at the Coliseum was the night that they finally said, fuck it, we'll just put you guys over because you're from here and we're leaving. So we actually pinned the Road Warriors on the way out when we weren't supposed to. The finish was supposed to be them going over, right? Well, they made that change and it got back to the office and they got mad. Because they were supposed to beat the Midnight Express. So the next night in St. Louis, they said, fuck it. We're not beating you. They said, no, you have to win the match. You have to beat the Midnight Express. They said, fuck it, we're not. So they had Ellering, they jerked me into the ring and had Ellering pin me 1, 2, 3. And that's the way they beat the Midnight Express, even though we weren't wrestling in the match. Because it was that level of petty. And that the same night that the Ruse people were there. Do you remember Ruse, Brian? Shoes for your feet and pockets for your stuff?
Of course, those commercials. I wanted a pair until I realized how impractical they were.
Yeah, and stupid and out of business they are now because they were the sponsors because they were based in St. Louis and somehow Herd knew them. So that's the night they did a $30,000 house in St. Louis, which is less than 3,000 fucking people. And Flair and Luger had to wrestle each other for the world title wearing the fucking tennis shoes. I'm surprised they didn't break their fucking ankles, but it looked so fucking ludicrous. So this is the kind of thing that they were doing. There was 2,300 people there in St. Louis at the Kiel Auditorium, and that's supposedly Herd's hometown. So that's the kind of things they had done through May, and it continued much the same in June. I'm just looking to see if there's any highlights, but there's actually not. And, of course, we're on the buttermilk run one weekend. They're paying me $3,000 fucking week guaranteed, right? One weekend they had me in Gastonia, North Carolina, Beckley, West Virginia, and Frankfort, Kentucky. Me and the Midnight Express versus the fucking Southern Boys. And that was allegedly a fucking weekend of house shows that they've somehow figured that they ought to run. At the same time, actually, as they were running St. Petersburg, Orlando, and Sunrise that weekend, and the best house down there was 3,000 people. One of them was 1,500. And that was the A team. So this continues through. We have no momentum. We did a Charleston, or did a Clash of Champions in Charleston, South Carolina in June, where we had, I think it was the Midnight and Rock and Roll, so it wasn't bad, but it was probably our worst TV match. It was quick. It was a disqualification. Didn't gel, right? But it was out of nowhere. We hadn't been even working a program with them, and it didn't lead to anything. But at least we defended the U.S. Tag Team Championship. So even though we're in these tank towns every weekend or every night, and they're drawing no people anywhere, and we're winning no matches, somehow on television we're still being portrayed as the champions. So we thought at least there's hope, right? And finally, and June it folds into July, and there was a lot of off days, which normally we had leading into the Great American Bash season, where they'd give us a few days off toward the end of June because we were going to be running so hard. But then finally, the last week in June comes, and listen to this schedule, Brian. And you remember that the main Great American Bash cities the previous several years had been Philadelphia, Charlotte, Richmond, Virginia, Baltimore, Landover, Maryland, Norfolk, Greensboro, Fayetteville, Johnson City, Atlanta, Raleigh, Pittsburgh, Chicago, right? These big mega gates. Yeah. Well, we start the last week of June of 1990 in Gainesville, Georgia, on a Monday night doing a TV taping, where basically we just did promos. We weren't featured on the TV show, right? I'm just speaking personally, Midnight and myself. Then we go to Niagara Falls, Canada, where Bobby loses a single match to Brian Pillman and Stan loses a single match to Scott Steiner for $200. Then June 27th, Toronto, one of the great fucking North American wrestling cities, right? Of all time. And if you could have added to that, halcyon lineup of great wrestling towns that I just mentioned, you'd want a Great American Bash in Toronto, right? Except you'd want it at the Maple Leaf Gardens or at one of at any building that anybody's ever heard of. Once again, we're at a college someplace. We got $200. I can't remember whether there was 1,000 people there or not, but even it took us forever to get there. It was by a lake. And listen to this card to go to Toronto with. Ric Flair versus Lex Luger, U.S. champion versus world champion. Then TV champion Arn Anderson versus Junkyard Dog. Rick and Scott Steiner versus Doom. Midnight Express versus the Southern Boys, Tracy Smothers, Steve Armstrong. And 2 preliminaries. And the Southern Boys were wonderfully over, and I mean it, all of us Southern Boys were wonderfully over in Toronto, but no, there was nobody there. So we've been 2 days in Canada. We made $400. Then the next day, June 28th, is Brantford, Ontario, where somebody didn't show up because somebody else had cracked. And because people were leaving the trips in some cases, like Stan had, and people that was happening, right? So Bobby works with Nick DiCarlo, local guy, a famous Frank Monty and Nick DiCarlo tag team. Bobby beats DiCarlo and then fucking puts Rick Steiner over, and Stan puts Scott over in a single match. The main events on that card that were supposed to draw the money were Lex Luger and JYD against Ric Flair and Arn Anderson.
Whoever had Frank Monty is getting a mention in their drinking game this week. Drink now.
Well, there you go. And Doom versus the Southern Boys. That was the money matches on that show. The following day, it was supposed to be Detroit, Michigan, but somehow the card was changed and we were off and got to go home. But they ran Detroit, and I don't know how they did, but it probably wasn't very good. And then we were actually going to be on Chicago on the 30th as well, but the card was changed and we were off that too. But the main event there was Lex Luger and Paul Orndorff substituting for Sting. So the only time you'd be pissed about seeing Paul Orndorff against Ric Flair and Barry Windham, and JYD versus Arn Anderson, and the Steiners versus Doom. But that was the money matches. And then they continued on July 1st in Cincinnati and drew no people, and we weren't there. And then we joined up with them again on July 2nd in Marietta, Georgia, where we did another TV taping for $150. Oh, and we had just got another contract payment. They paid us $4,819. At least they did myself on the previous 2 weeks. The payoffs did not match my contract amount.
Can I ask you a question?
You certainly may.
If Tully had come back, if everything hadn't gone astray, if Jim Herd hadn't pulled the offer and cut Arn's offer, if Tully comes back in November of 89, what do you think Tully's saying by the summer of 90?
He would be happy with the money that he was making, and he would be the most miserable motherfucker to be sitting around in the locker room because he would be dissecting at length and be correct. Exactly what the fuck. So anyway, we do a TV in Marietta on July 2nd. But I know you're thinking, wait a minute, July 3rd was off. I did some radio in Charlotte, right? But you're thinking July 4th. That's the big day actually of the month for the month of July and a Great American Bash. And we were in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the Midnight Express beat the Southern Boys, the Southern Boys beat the Midnight Express, and we got paid $250. It was on a Wednesday night, even though it was July the 4th. The house is not recorded in any book that I don't remember, once again, there being 1,500 people there. And the following day, here's a big bash tradition city, July 5th, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And the same thing, $200 payoff. And then Norfolk. Now, and bear in mind, now Greensboro, if you've missed our previous shows, Greensboro for the Great American Bash in 86 did $257,000. In 88 had done $100,000. In 90, didn't even register. Norfolk, Virginia, in 1986 had sold out $157,000. 87 had sold out $180,000, higher ticket prices. 88 had done over $100,000. We got a $200 payoff. Nobody told us what the house was. So finally we get to July 7th in Baltimore is the pay-per-view, Great American Bash 1990. Because they figured, all right, Baltimore was the only house the previous year, right, that actually did good, and they somehow it had become the home of the Great American Bash. So this time, unfortunately, what they found out was the previous year they had wanted to remember to see Flair come back and kick shit out of Terry Funk.
Yeah.
Well, now they were placed in a position. Originally, Sting was going to win the championship at what was a Super Brawl, but the February pay-per-view when he had
Wrestle War 90.
Wrestle War, when he had gotten his knee injured at the Clash of Champions 2 weeks beforehand. Instead, Lex Luger turned babyface suddenly, took Sting's place against Flair, but Luger did not win the title because Flair had promised the belt to Sting. Sting was supposed to be the next guy to get it. They took those things seriously back in those days, especially Flair. And so it was put off until Sting could come back amazingly that quick. So they figured, okay, but the problem was even they did do 10,000 people and 8,900 were paid. And I do not have the house, but we got a $400 payoff that night. And then later on, they gave us $2,000 on the pay-per-view, but which was all against our contract anyways. It was all that we were getting to begin with, but at least there was some interest, but it wasn't like seeing Ric Flair come back from a near career ending injury and kick shit out of, Terry Funk. It was, well, now they need to want to see Sting. And I think honestly, they had wanted to see Sting win it in February more than by the time they got it in July. Because in all honesty, the company had 5 months more to fuck shit up, right? And they'd gone through another, actually 2 booking changes since Sting got hurt. Flair was the booker when he got hurt. They had a committee for fucking 8 weeks and then Ole. So in the first 6 months of the year, they had 3 different booking teams and all these plans got blah, blah, blah. But the card was Sting versus Flair, was Doom for the World Tag Title against the Rock and Roll Express, Lex Luger, U.S. title against Mark Callis with Paul Lee, who would obviously later become Mark Calloway. JYD, Orndorff, and El Gigante against Arn Anderson, Barry Windham, and Sid Vicious. The Steiners versus the Fake Birds, Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin. And Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, the Midnight Express, the U.S. Tag Team Champions, for whatever reason, because we lose constantly, except we never lose on pay-per-view. We beat the Southern Boys when, once again, we lose every television match that we have, which is non-title. We put guys over in singles matches or tag matches in every house show, but when the pay-per-views come up, somehow we win. But this time, Ole said, but now don't use the fucking racket, Cornette. Yeah, beat him with a wrestling fucking finish. So, all right, motherfucker. So that's why I came up with that goddamn multi-phase, false finish back. Well, it's not anything extravagant today with the 87 false finishes, but back when you didn't see such a thing, and why that got over so well, we had another one of those pesky match of the years with the Southern Boys, where we actually, and Tracy and Steve were a great team, and they were fabulous to work with. But between that generic hootenanny music that they had them come out to on the pay-per-view and the fact that they're wearing Confederate uniform dusters in Baltimore, but by the time that as you remember, by the time the match was over, they stood up and cheered both teams and the match, which was the best we could hope for at that point, because they weren't going to boo us, right? But that was now then what they had finally wanted. Hurd had wanted to get that belt off of Flair and get it on anybody at that point, but definitely Sting. And they were thinking they were going to, now with Ole as Booker, bring in some new blood, Ole, which is when Ole started bringing in those guys who were greener than pepper trees, right? But what they had done, once again, to the backbone of the business, continuing the Baltimore Bash, yes, the pay-per-view, they did draw a halfway decent house. But then we come back down to fucking earth the following day when we go back to Roanoke, Virginia, and we get beat by the Rock and Roll Express. But for this time a $300 payoff, they just basically pay you a couple or $300 in those days, WCW, to pay for your road expenses to go and have these matches in front of no people and do TV tapings. And then they were just sending guys their contract payments afterwards, which was what bred such complacency in guys, whether they showed up or not, how hard they worked or not. If you didn't give a shit and were just there for the money, you were happy. But if you gave a shit, you were fucking frustrated as fuck. So that kind of had the locker room somewhat split down the middle. In July 9th, we go back to Gainesville for Gainesville, Georgia, for another TV taping. And then we get 2 days off because we went to do that Awake on the Wild Side MTV appearance. For some reason, they couldn't draw a house in any major city in the country, but they got us on MTV. And the reason why it was us was because they asked for somebody who could actually talk on television, halfway cut a promo, and they knew wouldn't show up in the morning hungover. So it boiled down to me and the Midnight Express. But at the same time, they have a crew out west. They ran Tulsa on July 12th. No, as a matter of fact, that was where we picked it up. They were somewhere on the 11th, but on the 12th, we're in Tulsa and actually do a $32,000 house, almost 3,000 people. There's a little life there. We worked with the Southern Boys, but it was at least a pulse of a house show, right? But you still got your $300,000. Dallas the following day was maybe about $30,000, and you got your $300 payoff. The following day, they're in St. Louis, the home of the NWA and the home of goddamn Ruse and the home of Jim Herd and the home of everything. And for a Great American Bash level production, they draw $30,000 and we get $300, and we work with the Southern Boys. It was almost like a vaudeville team at that point that was just going out in these interchangeable buildings in front of approximately the same number of people. And yeah, as a matter of fact, then our contract payment was only $3,200 that week because they actually raised the per diem we were getting to $300. And I know people are saying, well, Cornette, you're complaining about the fucking money. But as I've mentioned, we were making more money when Crockett was doing the payoffs and we didn't have a guaranteed contract that we were at this point from these fucking people. And it was at least, I was always proud of being able to go out in these big shows. And we got up for the big shows, the bash matches, where we've drawn this crowd and the building is sold out. And our performance is a key part of it. And you took pride in that rather than going out in these dead atmospheres in half these towns you shouldn't be in anyway. And that the office couldn't sell pussy on a troop train, much less a wrestling ticket, no matter Frank fucking Gotch was on the card. And it was a very trying era. Anyway, on July 16th, we're back in Gainesville, Georgia, which is the only place they could do a syndicated TV show anymore. And we got $150. And then thankfully, the Midnight Night got a couple of days off. I think they gave the whole company a few days off. Tuesday and Wednesday, why run them in the middle of bash season? Thursday, July 19th was Savannah, Georgia. $350 payoff against the Steiners. Friday, July 20th, Augusta, Georgia did $39,000. We had the Steiners, and I remember enjoying that because in Augusta, $39,000 looked good. And I was like, why the fuck that this happened? We don't know. It must have been accidental, but we enjoyed it very much. Then July 21st, St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, remember, they've done bashes in Jacksonville and done six-figure houses in the past. And Florida's a legendary wrestling area, right? St. Petersburg, $32,000 on July 21st, so less than 3,000 people at the Bayfront Center. And as a matter of fact, you'll love this. This show was snake bit. Not only did Sting and Luger beat Barry Windham and Harley Race instead of Ric Flair, because Flair actually did have a staph infection in his knee and couldn't work. He was in the corner. So Harley had to work in the main event. But also, that's when Stan was going through that paternity suit dispute, shall we say. And he was found not guilty, folks, or whatever the verbiage is. But he couldn't work in Florida at that point in time, so Buddy Landell fills in with Bobby Eaton as the Midnight Nature Boy Midnight Express against the Steiners. That's where we're having the match, and the light in the Bayfront Center gets so hot it explodes, and the hot burning glass falls in the ring on top of all of us, melting the plastic of my tennis racket cover. The fucking show was snake bit from the fucking start. It was goddamn rotten. So then we're in Miami the following day. 2,000 people at the fucking Night Center. Same basic result. Then guess where we went back to on Monday, July 23rd, Brian Last? You'll never guess this.
Gainesville, Georgia.
Gainesville, Georgia, to do the fucking TV tape. Is goddamn, what the fuck? It was insane. Then we had a couple of days off. Thank fucking God. After all of that mess, then we go to Charleston, South Carolina on July 26th, do $29,000, match against the Steiners. Richmond, Virginia. Let's see, Richmond in 1986 did $115,000 sellout, and 87 did $125,000, and 88 did $109,000, and actually did $140 for the show that followed it up that year. In 89, they didn't run one, I don't believe, or if we did, I don't know what it did. And they came back, and Friday, July 27th, they ran Richmond, Virginia at the Coliseum. We wrestled the Steiners. Also on that card, Ric Flair, all the top fucking names. Nobody was there. $250 payoff. We had like fucking couple thousand people, maybe. And then we had a couple more days off. Although they did run Asheville, and they just included us, and Knoxville, and included us out, but nothing happened. And then on Monday, July 30th, I know you're not going to believe this, but guess where we were? Gainesville, Georgia. But actually the boys The boys didn't have to go to Gainesville those past couple of weeks, just me, because I had to host the goddamn Louisville Slugger. I forgot. They weren't even there. They weren't featured on the TV tab the last 3 weeks in a row. So every week I would just get up and drive to fucking Gainesville, Georgia, and do the Louisville Slugger, where I'd do a 30-second intro and then interview somebody else about fucking their upcoming shit. And then I would literally get in my fucking car and come back home. So it was a 420-mile round trip to do a 3-minute fucking pre-tape. And people wondered why I hated the fucking people. But at least the midnight were off TV, so they couldn't beat us anymore. So that was the best part about that period. But it was just, once again, and that's when Ole had, I want to give you the, and Tuesday, July 31st and Wednesday, August 1st, were off for myself and the Midnight Express, and apparently everybody else, because they didn't start running shows until the 2nd of August, where they were in Columbia, South Carolina, and then back in Greensboro on August 3rd, where they were lucky to do 4,000, but we were in Pittsburgh that night, where they did probably about 1,600 and we got $200. But let me give you the Greensboro show for the 1st of August, where Ole had been booking for a while. The Star Blazer pinned Dutch Mantell. Norman the Lunatic, well, I think he had become a trucker.
Yeah.
Pinned Zan Panzer, who was Brad Anderson.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
Gene Anderson's son.
Yeah. Tommy Rich beat Buddy Landell in 1990. Big Van Vader pinned Tom Zink. I can't argue with that. Mike Rotunda defeated the Iron Sheik. That's when they brought the Sheik back to see if they could get some jobs out of him, because Ole's like, fuck him, we're going to pay him. And the jobs were so bad, they sent him back and paid him for the rest of the year. Trey Smothers and Steve Armstrong, the Southern Boys, defeated Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin, the Fabulous Fake Birds. NWA TV champion Arn Anderson and Barry Windham defeated the Junkyard Dog and Paul Orndorff. NWA World Champion Sting pinned Ric Flair, but then Flair, Anderson, and Wyndham got heat on. Okay, it's a nice little house show, but that wasn't the Great American Bash, right? Or anything like it. None of that shit was. They didn't even try. They didn't even make an effort. At that point, it was, okay, we got these contract guys, and let's get some guys that can work cheap underneath. Because in Pittsburgh, we defeated, instead of Johnny Ace and Local that we were originally booked against, we beat Brad Armstrong and Dave Sierra, the Cuban Assassin. Bam Bam Bigelow pinned Wendell Cooley. Mark Callis pinned Doug Furness. The Steiners beat Samoan SWAT team. Lex Luger versus Sid Vicious. Rock and Roll Express versus Doom. And El Gigante won a 14-man battle royal.
I have no memory of Wendell Cooley working for WCW in 1990.
I think when they were trying to run 2 towns a night, and it didn't last long, so he didn't either. But the point, there was talent there, but it was spread out over 2 towns. And in one case, it was and that Pittsburgh wasn't even the Civic Arena either. It was some fucking off-brand building in town. It had come to that. So basically, that's the point. Is you see that everybody has such fond memories of the Great American Bash in the mid-'80s for a reason, because they were huge cards with guys that were hot currently at the time and a big-time promotion. And whether you like it or not, and we didn't most of the time, even the country music stars, it was name people doing big shit at major arenas in town. And all of a sudden it had become these fucking wrestlers that can't find the goddamn high school or college gym in fucking downtown Boston in front of anywhere from 300 to goddamn 1,500 people most of the time, and occasionally a couple of grand, to do the same shit that they did every fucking night and for the same basic money. And that's not, it demoralized, I think, the roster, as much as everybody will say they enjoyed obviously getting the money that they were supposed to get. Whether they'll tell you the truth or not, when that became all you were going to get, it demoralized you, because you were in the wrestling business because you always had the carrot. You always thought, if we get hot and we get on top, because they said, oh, fuck, if you go to fucking Louisiana, Watts will screw you. Well, he screwed us, but he also paid us fucking 6 figures one year, more than anybody else would have in that era. And then within a couple of years, we're working for Jimmy Crockett, who on payoffs paid us almost double that a couple of years later. But when you felt you were a contribution to the increase in the business and you were featured part of the show, that's when, and anybody that's been in that position in the WWE will tell you, that's when you did your shit. That's when you really put your passion into things. But if you're doing the same shit every night for about the same return, both in terms of live audience feedback and financial gain, and you know because of the place you're working, it's not going to get a lot better. It hinders or hampers your performance. I'm on the soapbox now.
Well, let me ask you this, Jim. You quit WCW right after Halloween Havoc 90. Jim Herd lasts about a year more, maybe a little less than a year. Dusty comes back as Booker. In the beginning of 91, you revealed here on the show a little while back that you had conversations with Dusty about coming back at that point, but of course, Jim Herd was still there.
Jim Herd was still there.
When you quit, I mean, did you have any idea in your mind? Did you think Jim Herd's going to have this job for the next 5 years? Did you think he would last only a year? Like, when you quit, how much longer did you think Jim Herd would be there?
Actually, at that, I didn't stop to evaluate that at that particular point in time. But I had no reason to believe he was going anywhere, and it wasn't like he was rushed out the door anytime after that. Because it didn't seem it mattered what kind of talent he ran off or what kind of bonehead shit he did or stuff he foisted off on television or even the stuff that he suggested that he couldn't foist off or whatever. Nobody had made any move to act like that he had any heat whatsoever, because we all heard his best friend was I won't say his best friend. Petrick's wife was his wife's best friend or whatever. That's how he got the fucking job.
Yeah.
So no, but at the same time, at that point, I knew the company was going to be a fucking mess for the foreseeable future, no matter, because as we'd seen going through all those booking changes and the houses sucking and the schedule sucking and the whole thing, it wasn't going to get different anytime soon, and I was not going to enjoy it anytime more. And all I was looking for was the following May anyway, because that's when our contracts would be up again. So I knew by October, I knew, no, May, fuck this. If they try to give us another one, I ain't taking it. We wanted to, at the previous one, we wanted to stay because where else are you going to get that kind of money guaranteed? And we still had the element of this is our fucking place more than it is that motherfuckers. We've been here longer. We've helped more, helped build it more, etc. We'll wait the motherfucker out. But by that point, it was like, no, May will be it. So all I was looking at was 6 months ahead of time anyway.
On the topic of contracts, you've obviously been dealing with Jim Herd a lot because you're on the booking committee with Ric Flair. You already don't like him, but you've been dealing with him for a long time, and I'm sure Bobby and Stan aren't. They're just hearing through you what's going on. So I'm curious what their reaction, specifically Stan, when that moment happens when Jim Herd walks up to you and says, I was against this, and hands you the contract, and now they're witnessing Jim Herd. I don't know how much they had seen beforehand, but what was Stan and Bobby's reaction to that moment?
I'm sure he had walked by him in the hallway a few times. We used to joke that fucking George Scott has not to this day spoken to Bobby Eaton. When he came in, we had a meeting where he never actually addressed Bobby by looking at him and speaking directly to him. The one meeting where he said, his famous quote was, I just don't know what I'm going to do with you boys. And one other time when we were going into the meeting, Bobby held a door open for him and he walked right past Bobby. Bobby started calling himself Casper the Ghost. And it was about the same thing from Herd. They didn't, and they were, well, Bobby never says anything about anybody, but even Bobby was not, complimentary. I mean, he just, gave that kind of the Bobby thing. But no, Stan was not, because I said, look at that. And just to make sure they heard it, we huddled afterwards. I said, just to make sure I heard that right? Fuck. But
well, hold on though. After that first meeting with George Scott, who was the first person to say, did you notice he didn't talk to Bobby?
I think we kind of mutually came up to what the fuck, because I think Bobby just said, am I here? Am I invisible? Am I Casper? And they already knew what the fuck Hurd's issue was and the way he felt about the whole goddamn thing. So it wasn't a surprise. And once again, we were not signing those contracts because we were all gung-ho about, staying part of the team. We were signing them honestly because the team needed to stay together, and we couldn't tell Bobby not to take a 6-figure job when he had kids and we did not. That was already the joyous occasion upon which we were signing that agreement to begin with.
You, Dennis, and Bobby famously met with Vince McMahon in, I believe, the summer of '86 about potentially coming up there, and you've told that story many times. While all this is going on, do you at all think maybe I should talk to someone up there? Maybe I should approach them? I mean, the Road Warriors just go up there in the spring of 1990, and obviously there were several other defections in the next year and a half.
No. Because by then, to me, to be honest with you, Stan was not going to wrestle but another couple of years, as you'll recall.
Did you know that already?
No.
Did you think it?
No, he didn't know that either. He didn't know that until he just decided one day. But the thing was, I think Stan probably, Bobby was just like, okay, here, give me, because it's our home and we're in Charlotte. He's still in it. He had bought a house. He's still in his house. It was 6 figures. Give it to me. All right, whatever the fuck. Stan, I think, was now looking more at the goddamn schedule. Like it was almost like, well, fuck, they would beat us to death on the road in the WWF. And at that point, it was now a situation where we would have had to have worked harder on the body in the WWF than we were in what the fuck we were doing, right? Stan's thinking, I'm losing fucking singles matches to fucking Art Barr with a sunset flip. Why the fuck argue? And I was not going to bring it up because if we made that commitment, I already had the germ of Smoky Mountain Wrestling by summer of 1990. So I wasn't going to do anything else after WCW but that. Whether I could, regardless of whether I could have or how much, whether I would have made more money.
You've been pretty vocal about the positives, and I should probably stress the negatives of the 1989 tag team scene in the NWA. What did you think in 1990? Now you have the Southern Boys, the Nasty Boys come in there right before you leave. What did you think about what was happening in terms of tag team wrestling? Doom and the Steiners on top?
Well, it was great. I wish we could have been a bigger part of it. The thing is they had all those great tag teams, but at the same time, not only were they starting to kind of subvert the tag team title, when they had a tag team main event, it was more combinations of the top baby faces. What were they during were they the dudes with attitudes during Ole's time?
The dudes with attitudes, yes.
Yeah, well, the fucking people gave them the attitude, but it was tag matches with them against some group that could be identified as horsemen. But I've said I don't think that Garvin and Hayes as the Freebirds worked, but it wasn't horrible. But they still continued trying to go, probably because of Ole's past experience with Michael and those guys. But they tried to continue going with them. Doom was a great team, and I liked both Ron and Butch, and thought that they were fresh and new, and so that was great. But I wish we'd have got a chance to work more with the Steiners, because not only did the Steiners like working with us, but they had their best matches with the Midnight Express because we didn't have to worry about being the big guys that couldn't be thrown around. And so it was easier for the Steiners to do their shit. But every time we'd have some type of really good match with them, we'd never fucking work with them again for the next 2 months and never on a big show. And with the Southern Boys, same thing. We have the match at the Bash where the people in Baltimore give the Southern Boys a standing ovation. And then never again on a big show. I think we had one other TV match with them. So we couldn't get any programs going with anybody to do any good because of just the stop-start, haphazard booking. What the fuck? As everybody remembers, our last pay-per-view match was against Ricky Morton and Tommy Rich because Robert Gibson had hurt his knee. So, but on pay-per-view, Ricky Morton and Tommy Rich, the first time ever teaming, beats the Midnight Express in the opening match, which also happens to be one of the top 2 best matches of the fucking night. And we can't even beat the makeshift team. It just got to that point where all the tag teams were just in a puddle down there, subverted like a plate full of piss, and nobody was standing out, and they weren't keeping the guys strong that could actually get other guys over. So there was a lot of talent there. They were just, it was like a pinball game. They were bumping around against each other.
let's say you had the program with the Steiner brothers. How would Stan Lane have liked working with the Steiners every night for 2 months?
Probably not, but actually, no, they were, no, Rick and Scott were both always really, I won't say professional because that indicates that they wouldn't be with other people, but they were, and I don't want to say careful because they didn't baby anybody, but they were very careful with the Midnight Express because they respected them, because they were veterans and because they learned shit when they got in the ring with them. And Scotty had only been working a couple years at that point. And they had, like I said, their most exciting matches where it was, they could do all their shit and do it easier than with anybody else with us. So they always took care of us to make sure that nothing happened. We never had any complaints working with the Steiners.
I'm curious too, obviously you have all these records and they're incredible, and I'm looking forward to some of the deep dives that we're going to do in the months ahead here on the show. But in terms of the nomad period between WCW and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, do you have the detailed information for all those shows you worked? VWA, GWF, everything else you worked?
Believe it or not, I won't say detailed, but I do. Yes, I have that written down also. And I just grabbed it before I grabbed my 90 book, and I'm ashamed to tell anybody what I actually worked for back in those days when I'd never. That's the thing. In 1991, I'd never really done an independent show because before that they were outlaw shows, and I'd never done that type of thing. So I wasn't used to guaranteed payoffs, nor was anybody at that point. It was just getting started, guaranteed payoffs and everything. So I'll look at a couple of things I did for a couple of people that it was either close to home or, he's so-and-so is a nice guy. And I'm like, why did I do that?
Or one of those Joel Goodhart paydays.
No, that was actually the biggest, except for the LPWA tapings where I was doing commentary and helping produce behind the scenes, et cetera, et cetera. That was my biggest payoffs of the year for Joel Goodhart.
You turned down your biggest opportunity during that time. So, I mean, it's no wonder.
Which one was that?
The opportunity to book for Universal in Japan for shit.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot when Dr. Mike Lano huffed a little extra nitrous and got me booked in Japan, but that's another day, folks. But anyway, so basically, as you can see, by 1990, W said they were touring, I guess, under the theory of, well, that way we'll take in some money to pay the wrestlers, but they were losing so much money. It was more like they were touring just because they thought they were supposed to. I don't know, but they didn't care about anything except the TV ratings and the pay-per-view. But those were once again on a downswing because, and I'm just going to state facts again, Flair had gotten them up, but then you have not one but two changes in booking direction in like a fucking 2-month period.
And Ole was shot as a booker in 1983.
Well, and once again, Ole didn't do himself any favors, as with a lot of this stuff where he just went great, thus became the Master Blasters and the legendary stories of all the green guys. I was there that night when Nash's original fucking partner was in the ring with Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner at the Cobo in Detroit. And we were back in the back watching, and the guy fucked up the same spot 3 different ways, 3 times in a row with Brad Armstrong, and to the point where he just turned around and looked at Nash and spread his arms out wide as if to pantomime, clear as day. It was the only piece of work he did that was good in the whole match. What do they want from me? I don't understand what I'm doing here. It was just like that, right? And he went to the bus station. He quit that night. He went to the bus station and took a bus out of town and never came back. They never saw him again.
Well, you're in trouble when Kevin Nash is the Bobby Eaton of your team.
Oh, boy, howdy. But that was what he was doing. He was just, he was just trying to cheap guys. And I can honestly see Ole not arguing with Jim Herd nearly as much as Ric Flair had or as anybody else had, or even as probably Jim Ross did. He's probably, okay. You think you know what the fuck you're doing? Okay, Hurt, here you go. You're the fucking boss. I'm getting the same fucking check either way. I could be in Minnesota at the fucking lumber mill. Here you go. Boom, done. So who knows? But they dismantled the whole fucking thing. And it was till the late 90s that they started drawing any kind of crowds and live again.
And they eventually did cut house shows and stop running house shows. And in one way, that seems like a really bad move. But in another way, if it's just costing you money and it's not making you any money, why do it?
Yeah, and they figured out a way for the primary source of income in the wrestling business to actually cost them money. And that was why, that was pretty much the origination. I mean, I'm sure somebody had thought of it before then, but that became the blueprint for what happens when the dream of everybody in the wrestling business comes to fruition and a multi-millionaire media company buys a wrestling promotion. There's no stopping us now. Oh, yes, there is, because it will be a self-inflicted wound that takes you down every time. What's the recipe for disaster in wrestling? Just add suits. And we have the company known as WCW World Championship Wrestling to thank for it. So that's the kid's lesson in history for this week.